Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. As is tradition, with the closing of another year, I've put together a compilation of some of the most popular theories from 2025. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Magical power, the ultimate currency among witches and wizards. With enough of it, you can dazzle your classmates, climb the wizarding hierarchy, social or economic, and perhaps even dare to conquer the world. Whether it's used to protect, create, or destroy, magical power is the ultimate force that shapes the destinies of witches and wizards. But given its significance, what is magical power really? Is it simply raw strength, the ability to cast more powerful spells than anyone else? Or is it something deeper, something tied to intellect, skill, or even character? If that's the case, what sets the most powerful wizards, like Voldemort and Dumbledore, apart from others? And perhaps most importantly, what makes performing magic hard? What is it that separates a simple spell from a complex one? Today we'll be diving into 3 of my theories as we peel back the layers of magical power in Harry Potter. Let's dive into it. When Dumbledore was still just a student at Hogwarts, he performed magic that Griselda Marchbanks, the head of the Wizarding Examinations Authority, described as something she had never seen before. And shortly thereafter, he went on to win numerous wizarding accolades, including the Barnabas Finkley Prize for Exceptional Spellcasting, an award presented for outstanding spellcasting techniques, as well as a gold medal for groundbreaking contributions to the International Alchemical Conference. But this was just the beginning of Dumbledore's remarkable string of achievements. As his skill and reputation grew, he became widely regarded as one of the most gifted wizards of his time, with his academic brilliance and groundbreaking experiments resulting in some of the most significant contributions ever made to the wizarding world. But the crowning jewel of his career, his defeat over the other contender for the title of the most powerful wizard of the era, Gellert Grindelwald. A young Tom Riddle had a much slower start than Dumbledore, but once he arrived at Hogwarts, he quickly proved to be the most impressive student the school had seen since Dumbledore. Riddle's potential was immediately apparent, and his achievements as a student were nothing short of extraordinary. By his 5th year, he had become a prefect and later earned the title of head boy, all while maintaining an immaculate academic record. In his quest for power, Riddle delved into the darkest branches of magic, driven by the same obsession with immortality and supremacy that would define his life. By his teenage years, he had already mastered the forbidden art of creating Horcruxes, a feat so complex and sinister that it remained beyond the comprehension of, well, pretty much everyone. Riddle not only succeeded in crafting one Horcrux, but went on to create many, fracturing his soul in pursuit of immortality. And these accomplishments, though abhorrent, demonstrated an extraordinary understanding of magic and an unmatched ability to manipulate its darkest depths. But the most impressive part about all of this, that Riddle maintained an immaculate public persona, earning titles like Head Boy and the prestigious Special Services to the School Award, despite being completely evil. His ability to balance dark ambitions with a flawless outward reputation made him one of the most cunning and formidable young wizards in Hogwarts history, foreshadowing his transformation into the feared and one day very powerful Lord Voldemort. By adulthood, both Voldemort and Dumbledore had a laundry list of magical capabilities that far surpassed those of any other witch or wizard. Dumbledore had mastered things like transfiguration, charms, potions, elemental magic, and occlumency. And Voldemort, on the darker side of things, could fly, create Horcruxes, control Inferi, and possess living creatures. Sure, some of these abilities were accessible to the lay wizard, but they weren't able to perform them to nearly the same level that Voldemort or Dumbledore could. They were simply in a league of their own. But what is it that makes them so special? They went to the same wizarding school as everyone else, they're both half-bloods, which a lot of students are, and their upbringings, while starkly different, weren't inherently magical. Dumbledore grew up in a modest household marred by tragedy, and Voldemort spent his formative years in a Muggle orphanage, disconnected from the magical world until he got to Hogwarts. So, what is it that made these two the most powerful wizards in history? Theory 1. Intelligence. An easy analogy to understand magical ability would be intelligence. The smarter you are, the easier it is to comprehend and pick up on the subtleties of magic, and therefore wield it. However, if intelligence were the primary contributing factor to magical power, then the smartest wizards would always be the most powerful, which we know isn't the case. And if you need further convincing, just look at Hermione Granger or Barty Crouch Jr., both of whom were undoubtedly the most brilliant witches and wizards of their age, mastering spellwork and theory far beyond their peers during their time at Hogwarts. Hermione achieved outstanding academic success, where she received the top grade of O in almost all of her subjects. And Barty Crouch Jr. is one of only 3 known characters to receive all 12 owls. Both were just naturally very intelligent. Things came easily to them. Yet, despite being nothing to scoff at, they don't particularly stand out in any conversation surrounding magical power. And I think that the distinction that needs to be made here is that intelligence can be measured in many different ways. Some witches and wizards may be incredibly intelligent, but still completely inept at certain tasks, or incapable of experiencing or processing specific emotions. And I think that this highlights how complex and nuanced the concept of intelligence truly is. There's practical wisdom, gained through years of life experience, alongside cunning, academic intelligence, and emotional intelligence, all of which play their own unique role. And crucially, none of these are inherently more important than the others. They all contribute to a person's overall capacity to navigate the world and, in the case of wizards, to wield magic effectively. And in the cases of Voldemort and Dumbledore, it's possible that they just happen to be far more well-rounded than most, achieving a near-perfect formula of qualities that set them apart. They combined raw magical talent, extraordinary intelligence, and unparalleled ambition with the discipline and focus necessary to master their craft. However, I still believe that, to achieve the things they did, they must have been among the greatest minds the wizarding world has ever known. Over the course of human history, countless brilliant minds have graced the world, but only a select few have truly stood out, those whose intellect and achievements left an indelible mark. Think of figures like Einstein, whose theories redefined physics, or Da Vinci, whose boundless curiosity and ingenuity spanned art, science, and engineering. These individuals weren't just smart, they applied their intelligence in ways that reshaped humanity's understanding of the world. History shows us that a group of bright minds working together can struggle to match the insights of a singular genius. And in the magical world, this same principle holds true, though brilliance isn't solely defined by academic success or raw intelligence. It's shaped by how one applies their knowledge, creativity, and moral compass. Dumbledore's power stemmed from his unmatched intellect, deep emotional insight, and the wisdom gained from his personal failures. He also wasn't just a master of spellwork, but a master of people, understanding the complexities of human nature and using that knowledge to lead and inspire. On the other hand, Voldemort's power was driven by an intense singularity of purpose. His ambition to conquer death and dominate the wizarding world pushed him to explore the darkest depths of magic. They were both highly intelligent in every way that wielding magic needed them to be. It wasn't just one trait, but a delicate balance of many that made them stand above the rest. And if we look at spellcasting as an indication of one's ability to perform magic, it becomes clear that intelligence and magical prowess are closely connected. All the greatest magic users are consistently praised for their academic brilliance and intellectual capacity. No wizards spring to mind that were intellectually deficient, yet capable of wielding extraordinary magical power. Professors at Hogwarts are another good example of this. These are individuals that are not only experts in magical theory, but also highly skilled practitioners. When Voldemort attacked Hogwarts, it wasn't the younger, more physically trained Aurors who stood alongside Kingsley Shacklebolt in battle, it was professors like Minerva McGonagall and Horace Slughorn. Theory 2. Innate magical power. They're born with it. The first thing I want to lay out here is that magic is an inherent part of the fabric of the universe and exists as a kind of energy that can be harnessed and manipulated by those with the ability to do so. And the next thing I want to clarify is that witches, wizards, and other creatures who possess magical abilities bear a gene that allows them to exploit the natural forces of magic. Witches and wizards are essentially advanced or mutated human beings that have either inherited the ability to exploit magic through their ancestry, or, in rarer occasions, independently developed the ability to exploit magic through a genetic mutation. They have advanced physiologies, heightened perception, and, if gifted enough, have the ability to control the world's elements to some extent. There's also a laundry list of additional physiological benefits besides the magical gene they possess. Given that the only thing separating Muggles from magical beings is this genetic difference, it's reasonable to argue that Voldemort and Dumbledore are simply more mutated. They represent a higher tier of magical evolution, and their genetic makeup and physiological traits are fine-tuned to an extent rarely seen in wizarding history. This idea of being more mutated could explain why these two individuals could achieve feats that other witches and wizards could only dream of. While most magical beings are like radios tuned to receive the frequencies of magic, Dumbledore and Voldemort were like precision instruments, capable of tuning into the rarest and most powerful frequencies with ease, possessing minds and bodies that were deeply attuned to the magical forces of the universe. If we go by this theory, then their power is rooted in their very biology, possessing bodies and minds that were simply better equipped to harness the full potential of magic. Theory 3. Strife. My third and final theory is that Dumbledore and Voldemort's level of magical power is a direct result of the pain and strife that they had to endure in their earlier life. Before either of them attended Hogwarts or exhibited any notable magical power, both boys endured a childhood filled with pain. Dumbledore's early life was filled with tragedy and loss. At the age of 10, his father was imprisoned in Azkaban after attacking the Muggle boys who had harmed and caused permanent damage to his sister, Ariana. This left Dumbledore in a broken home without a father figure, with the family eventually moving to the town of Godric's Hollow. Following Ariana's attack from the Muggle boys, she could no longer control her magic, and this subsequently led to the death of Dumbledore's mother when Ariana inadvertently caused a magical explosion that killed her. This left Dumbledore with the burden of responsibility for his troubled siblings, Aberforth and Ariana, at an age when most children are still discovering themselves. He was just a boy, and he already had the weight of the world on his shoulders. Voldemort's upbringing, though quite different from Dumbledore's, contained just as much pain. Born as Tom Riddle, he was the child of Merripy Gaunt, a witch who died shortly after his birth, and Tom Riddle Sr., a Muggle who abandoned her before Tom was born. Orphaned and left to grow up in a loveless environment at Wolves Orphanage, Tom experienced a childhood devoid of affection, security, or belonging. He was abandoned, forgotten, and forced to spend his childhood staring at the grey walls of Wolves Orphanage. And the truth is, he couldn't have been in an orphanage during a worse time period. The orphanage system in the UK only really began to take off in the 19th century, which meant that it was still very much in its infancy. And during Tom's time there, the circumstances were nothing short of terrible. The aftermath of the First World War had left a surplus of war orphans, combined with programs aiming to remove street children from the grim city streets. This sudden influx of children easily overwhelmed the existing system, resulting in overcrowded facilities and a severe lack of resources. The dire conditions led to scarce provisions, with it not being uncommon for multiple children to share a bed or sleep on the floor. Lack of nutritious food was a constant struggle, and orphans often subsisted on the same meagre and watered-down soup or porridge for weeks on end. Overworked caretakers, who were stretched thin and in many cases were neglectful or even abusive, added to the challenging atmosphere. To make matters worse, during this time many children as young as 12 were forced into labour, working grueling hours in docks and factories. With hygiene conditions deteriorating, diseases like diphtheria, cholera and measles flourished, leaving malnourished children with weakened immune systems vulnerable to these illnesses. And as if the conditions were not already dire enough, in 1931 the Great Depression struck the United Kingdom, coinciding with Tom being just 5 years old. Orphanages lost a significant portion of their funding, exacerbating the scarcity of food and resources. The reality of death surrounded the young children, with illness and disease claiming the lives of those all around them. Bearing all of this in mind, I want to put forward the theory that it was their shared history of suffering that acted as a catalyst for their exceptional magical ability. Rather than crumble beneath their hardships, they instead channeled their pain and leveraged it. Like diamonds formed under immense pressure, their genius and power were forged through adversity, ambition, and personal trials that would have broken lesser individuals. Dumbledore rose above his hardships, striving to make the world better despite his own flaws and regrets. Voldemort, on the other hand, allowed his pain to consume him, using it as justification for his cruelty and lust for power. It's entirely possible that magical power might be inherently tied to the emotional intensity of the witch or wizard wielding it. Strong emotions, love, fear, anger, and grief, are the keys to unlocking one's true magical potential. Another great example of this is Lily's loving sacrifice. The spell she cast to protect an infant Harry, Sacrificial Protection, was perhaps the single greatest and most powerful spell in Harry Potter canon, far more powerful and impressive than anything else she had ever cast. And what did it take for her to get there? Witnessing her family being murdered in front of her very eyes. And when Harry became the first wizard of his age to produce a powerful Patronus charm, what did it take for him to get there? Saving Sirius from the Dementors. I know he cast it before that at the Quidditch match, but it wasn't quite the same. The Killing Curse, Avada Kedavra. One of the 3 unforgivable curses, this dark spell is the ultimate symbol of disregard for life. Feared for its infamous reputation, the mere utterance of the words that comprise its incantation would send shockwaves of fear through the hearts of most in the wizarding world. But my question is, why isn't it used more often? No, I don't want it to be used more often, but it does feel a little underutilized in the series, given how powerful it truly is. Sure, it's an unforgivable curse, but what's really stopping a dark wizard from using it? Especially one that's already been to Azkaban and embraced a life of crime. Why risk losing a duel when you can end it with one simple spell? I mean, it's unblockable and irreversible, the perfect weapon. Today we'll be diving into 5 unique reasons for why Avada Kedavra isn't used more in the wizarding world. Let's dive in. Before we dive into the minutiae of why Avada Kedavra isn't used more often by the more dark magic-inclined members of wizarding society, let's first address why it isn't used by the general populace. Though we don't have an exact date, the record books indicate that the curse was invented as early as the Middle Ages, sometime between the 5th and 15th century. The curse itself is generated by uttering the incantation Avada Kedavra, which then creates a blindingly intense green bolt of light capable of instantly killing a victim upon impact. The spell serves a simple purpose. It puts an end to the victim's life. And for many centuries, this powerful spell could be freely used by the wizarding population. However, in the year 1717, Avada Kedavra was finally outlawed and deemed unforgivable by the Ministry of Magic, alongside 2 other curses, Crucio, the Torture Curse, and Imperio, the Mind Control Curse. These curses were deemed unforgivable because of their sadistic nature, and the general consensus among wizardkind was that these spells were too powerful and cruel to be used freely in the wizarding world. The capacity to torture people, control them against their will, and kill them with a single incantation was just not something that could be left unrecognized or unpunishable in society. And so, when legislation was finally passed by the ministry to name these 3 curses unforgivable, the strictest penalties were put in place and attached to their use. Utilizing one of these 3 curses just one time could land you a life sentence to Azkaban. And this singular deterrent, albeit a strong one, was enough for most in wizarding society. Of course, unless the witch or wizard performing the curse was underage and under the trace, there's no way for the ministry to even detect that these curses are being used. However, if you were suspected of a crime and went to trial, they would eventually be able to check your wand and confirm whether or not you had cast the spell. And this is probably what stopped most criminals, besides the truly crazy ones, from using the spell. But for a wizard that's already committed themselves to a life of crime, jail time in Azkaban is hardly a deterrent, so why not use them? I've narrowed this down to a few reasons. 1. It's not that easy to cast. If Fake Moody's Defense Against the Dark Arts lessons taught us anything, it's that in order to cast any of the unforgivable curses properly, you need sufficient power behind them. Avada Kedavra is a curse that needs a powerful bit of magic behind it. You could all get your wands out and point them at me and say the words, and I doubt I'd get so much as a nosebleed. But that doesn't matter. I'm not here to teach you how to do it. What this means is that it's not necessarily accessible for just anyone. Just because you know the incantation, it doesn't mean that you can cast the spell effectively. However, to this point, I would argue that most, if not all of Death Eaters, do have enough magical power to cast it. But there is another bottleneck. In order to master any of the unforgivable curses, you must fundamentally align yourself with what the curse is trying to achieve. You need an unyielding desire to cast the spell. This is referenced by Bellatrix in the Order of the Phoenix. Never used an unforgivable curse before, have you, boy? You need to mean them, Potter. You need to really want to cause pain, to enjoy it. Righteous anger won't hurt me for long. I'll show you how it's done, shall I? And what this means is that you need to possess a deep, unrelenting desire to end a life. Which brings me to my next point: moral considerations and stigma in society. The unforgivable curses are considered unforgivable not just because of their effects, but because they represent a fundamental breach of ethical principles. They are designed to cause extreme suffering, eliminate personal autonomy, and take life without justification. And so mustering the unrelenting desire to end a life is not as straightforward as it may seem, even for a Death Eater. Uttering this incantation bears a certain weight, and even among dark wizards, this spell has a connotation of irredeemable evil. There are dark witches and wizards out there that are evil through and through, like Voldemort or Bellatrix Lestrange, but there are also just followers that lack the same level of conviction or malice required to cast a spell like this. These other dark wizards, while certainly complicit in dark deeds, may be motivated by fear, ambition, or peer pressure, rather than a true desire to inflict harm. And for them, casting Avada Kedavra crosses an emotional boundary that they may not be prepared to cross. Furthermore, even in the Muggle world, there are plenty of people that bear the capacity to kill that don't necessarily want to do it. If it's avoidable and they can achieve their desired outcome through other means or less lethal options, then many of them will go this direction. Alternative methods like intimidation, coercion, or non-lethal curses might be preferred if it avoids the permanence and potential consequences of outright murder. After all, ending a life is final, and even the most hardened individuals might hesitate when faced with that reality. This is why Avada Kedavra carries such a unique stigma. Using it is an admission, both to oneself and others, of crossing a line from which there is no return. It's not just a spell, but a declaration of intent, of purpose, and of irredeemable evil. And even the darkest wizards must weigh the psychological and symbolic cost of casting it. Ultimately, Avada Kedavra is not just feared for its power, but for what it represents. To cast it is to embrace darkness fully and without hesitation, something that not every dark wizard, no matter how corrupt, is capable of doing. And that's the real terror of the unforgivable curses. They don't just harm the victim, they transform the person casting them. To those dark wizards who are unwilling to bear the psychological toll of casting such a fundamentally evil spell, they may opt to instead use other dark and potentially fatal curses that don't require such a deep level of intent. And these alternative spells allow them to achieve their sinister goals without the same level of moral surrender that Avada Kedavra demands. And even if killing is the ultimate goal, I think that there is a further distinction between normal killing and killing with this curse. In the chapter entitled The Riddle House from the Goblet of Fire, we're provided with a description of the murder scene after Avada Kedavra had been used on them. The police had never read an odder report. A team of doctors had examined the bodies and had concluded that none of the riddles had been poisoned, stabbed, shot, strangled, suffocated, or, as far as they could tell, harmed at all. In fact, the report continued in a tone of unmistakable bewilderment, the riddles all appeared to be in perfect health, apart from the fact that they were all dead. The doctors did note, as though determined to find something wrong with the bodies, that each of the riddles had a look of terror upon his or her face. But as the frustrated police said, whoever heard of 3 people frightened to death? Because there is no physical trace of Avada Kedavra, it feels somewhat more sinister, as if it is destroying the very soul of that individual, and not just their corporeal form. We're getting a little more into theory territory here, and I do discuss this in great detail in my video, How Does Avada Kedavra Actually Kill You? Link in the description. But essentially my point is that killing with Avada Kedavra is a very different and much worse form of murder. It's clear in the books and films that one's corporeal form and soul exist as 2 very separate entities, with the former acting as a sort of container for the latter. When someone dies, their soul moves on, and their physical body remains in the land of the living like an abandoned shell. But I think that killing with Avada Kedavra has more finality. I think that rather than the soul moving on to wherever it may go, it's instead either destroyed completely, or perhaps even worse than that, sent to Limbo, the same place where Harry encounters the fractured piece of Voldemort's soul. It's worse because it denies them of the opportunity to move on, and takes away not just their life, but also their afterlife. Which brings me to my next point: damage to the soul. The truth is that Avada Kedavra not only damages the soul of those on the receiving end of it, it also causes irreparable damage to the caster. It's well known in the wizarding world that murder, in general, renders the soul unstable. The soul is supposed to remain intact and whole. Splitting it is an act of violation. It is against nature. But how do you do it? By an act of evil, the supreme act of evil. By committing murder. Killing rips the soul apart. For someone like Voldemort, who used murder as a means to encase fragments of his soul in Horcruxes, this was a deliberate and beneficial byproduct. However, for most dark wizards, the thought of disrupting the delicate balance that sustains their soul would likely be far less appealing. In Voldemort's case, the act of tearing his soul apart was a calculated choice, a necessary evil in his quest for immortality. But for the majority of dark wizards, such a deliberate mutilation of their own essence would be overkill. The soul, as described by Dumbledore, is meant to remain intact, whole, and undisturbed. Tearing it apart, even unintentionally, leaves behind an instability that cannot be repaired. Preference. Another reason for why I suspect Avada Kedavra isn't used even more is that some dark wizards simply enjoy demonstrating their power to their victims, and enjoy tormenting them. I'd imagine that, for a psychopath, killing someone right away would not satisfy the same craving as drawing the battle out and feeding off of their emotional turmoil. Avada Kedavra might just end the game too quickly, denying them the satisfaction of control or prolonged suffering. And I'd imagine that this would align with the psychological profile of many dark wizards, many of whom would derive pleasure from dominance and cruelty. Spells like Crucio or Imperio let them prolong their victim's suffering, toy with their emotions, and assert their control in a way that a swift death simply cannot provide. Each scream, each moment of terror from their victim feeds their ego, creating a sense of superiority that a quick and efficient kill would fail to deliver. In their eyes, death is the finale, but the suffering leading up to it is the true performance. They didn't want to kill everyone. The final reason for why I suspect that Avada Kedavra wasn't used more is that Voldemort and his followers still needed a population to rule over. If Voldemort killed everyone on his path to taking the throne of power in the wizarding world, then there wouldn't be anyone left to rule. Their ultimate goal wasn't just domination, it was the establishment of a new order where pureblood wizards reigned supreme. To achieve that, they needed subjects to govern, labor to exploit, and future generations to sustain their vision. Furthermore, Voldemort and his Death Eaters knew that if they completely annihilated the next generation of wizards, this would have been entirely counterproductive to their long-term plans. A ruler with no subjects has no power, and Voldemort's ambition was always about power, not destruction for its own sake. Of the Horcrux, wickedest of magical inventions, we shall not speak nor give direction. That quote comes directly from Magique Most Evil, a dark arts reference book written by the Dark Wizard and former Elder Wand owner Grindelwald in the Middle Ages. The book was taken from the Hogwarts Library's restricted section by Hermione in 1997 in the hopes of gaining a better understanding of Voldemort's Horcruxes. However, shockingly, even a dark arts text written by a dark wizard refused to give information on the horrific magical practice that is Horcrux creation. We eventually find out that there have only been 2 dark wizards in history that have successfully created them. The first being Herpo the Foul, an ancient dark wizard that hailed from Greece, and the second being a young boy by the name of Tom Riddle, Voldemort. However, what I've always wondered is, why didn't more dark wizards create them? Sure, a dark text written by a dark wizard warns against it, but I can't imagine a driven and powerful dark wizard, likely fueled by ego, being too dissuaded by the words of another wizard. After all, it certainly didn't stop Voldemort. Are we really supposed to believe that, over the course of wizarding history, only 2 dark wizards have created them? Also worth mentioning is that there is an even darker text out there named Secrets of the Darkest Art, written by a Mr. Al Bullock. This book, according to Hermione, gives explicit instructions on how to make Horcruxes, detailing the entire procedure, still unknown to us, for their creation. So again, given that an entire book exists dedicated to outlining how they are created, I'm finding it increasingly hard to believe that only 2 wizards actually did it. Today we're going to be tackling the question of, did more wizards create Horcruxes than we realize? And if not, why didn't they? Let's dive in. Creating a Horcrux, which defies the natural order of life and death, is considered one of the most abominable practices in the wizarding world. These cursed objects, created through an unnamed and forbidden process, are known for their ability to fragment the soul, preserving it beyond death and granting the creator an impenetrable shield of immortality. However, the process involved with creating said Horcrux is still very much shrouded in mystery. All we know is that J.K. Rowling feels as though the process is so horrible that it's hard to even talk about. I see it as a series of things you'd have to do. So you'd have to perform a spell, but you'd also... I don't even know if I want to say it out loud. I know that sounds funny, but I did really think it through. There are 2 things that I think are too horrible, actually, to go into detail about. But what we do know is that creating one comes at a great cost, one that Voldemort seemingly overlooked. Which brings me to my first theory for why so few wizards dared to create one. The price you pay. While it's likely that many dark wizards sought power and immortality, I suspect that most who were skilled enough to create a Horcrux were also wise enough to recognize the risks. Unlike Voldemort, who was blinded by arrogance and an insatiable hunger for dominance, my feeling is that most others understood that splitting one's soul, which is integral to the very act of creating a Horcrux, came at a terrible cost. What we have to remember here is that Horcruxes are soul containers, objects in which the Dark Witch or Wizard in question have successfully imparted a piece of themselves. And in order to place a piece of your soul in another object, it needs to be split, and ultimately destabilized, something which I imagine most Dark Wizards weren't willing to do. Ultimately, the soul, which is the life force by which both a corporeal and incorporeal form can be distinguished, is what defines us. A kind of immaterial, spiritual essence that serves as an actuating cause of an individual's life. It's what makes us tick. You can exist without your soul, you know, as long as your brain and heart are still working, but you'll have no sense of self anymore, no memory, no anything. There's no chance at all of recovery. You'll just exist as an empty shell. And your soul is gone forever. Lost. Harry Potter very much perpetuates the idea that ultimately the physical body is merely a shell, a vessel that merely transports the vital life force within, and because the soul is immaterial, it exists forever. Therefore, tampering with the soul comes with a much greater risk than merely tampering with the physical body, and Horcrux creation is a process whereby you are directly tampering with the soul, risking not just your physical body in the corporeal form, but also your very essence, your identity and consciousness. While dark magic often comes with a price, even Avada Kedavra does, I don't think there's any other spell with the same consequences as Horcrux creation. And that's because the act of splitting the soul is not just a means of achieving immortality, but also an irreversible mutilation that leaves the wizard fundamentally incomplete. And if you still need further convincing, look no further than the physical representation of Voldemort's tarnished soul that Harry encounters when he goes to Limbo. Harry turns slowly on the spot, and his surroundings seem to invent themselves before his eyes. He had spotted the thing that was making the noises. It had the form of a small, naked child, curled on the ground, its skin raw and rough, flayed-looking, and it lay shuddering under a seat where it had been left, unwanted, stuffed out of sight, struggling for breath. Also, just to clarify something, many fans believe that the child on the floor of King's Cross in Limbo was the piece of Voldemort's soul in Harry, but that's not true. It has since been confirmed by Rowling that the baby represented the current state of Voldemort's soul. Alright, now here's theory number 2. More wizards have Horcruxes than we know. I know that Horcrux creation isn't something that's approached lightly by anyone. I mean, even Voldemort gathered as much information as he could prior to embarking on his Horcrux adventure. However, I find it truly hard to believe that, with information readily available in the form of a book, only 2 wizards have gone through with the process. Voldemort was short-sighted, and in some ways that provides a great deal of clarity on why he may have been just one of 2 wizards to attempt it. However, he can't be the only one that was arrogant and reckless enough to go through with it anyway. And as it turns out, I'm right. There have been more wizards that have attempted it. Wizards would have been looking for ways to do exactly what Voldemort did for years, and some of the ways they would have tried would have killed them. So I imagine it, well, they're huge parallels. Splitting the atom would be a very good parallel in our world. I do imagine that other people are going to have tried. I think it would be naive not to think that people have been trying for a long time, and thought they succeeded and hadn't, or else maimed themselves or killed themselves in the attempt. It's such a dangerous thing to do. Here Rowling reveals that, over the course of history, there were likely many others who attempted to achieve the very same thing as a young Tom Riddle. She also reveals in a fairly ambiguous way that most of them probably killed themselves or simply failed. But I don't think she's entirely shutting the door here on the possibility of someone else achieving it. My first piece of evidence is that the book, Secrets of the Darkest Art, the same book that outlines the entire process, was written by someone who is not credited as having produced a Horcrux. I theorized in a previous video that Al Bullock, the author, may simply be a pseudonym or pen name for Herpo the Foul, but I do admit that one's a bit of a stretch. I know that theory and practical application are two very different things, but for the author of this book to truly stand behind what they were saying and seemingly publish accurate information, they must have had first-hand experience with the process. Therefore, I suspect that either they themselves made a Horcrux, or they witnessed someone making a Horcrux. And given that the only two known Horcrux creators existed about 3,000 years apart, I'm willing to bet that it was someone other than Herpo or Voldemort. Therefore, I suspect that far more wizards have successfully created Horcruxes than we might have previously realized. Voldemort, after all, was incredibly arrogant, and one of his crucial mistakes was not keeping the existence of his Horcruxes a more well-kept secret. It's entirely possible that others created Horcruxes, but simply remained far more discreet about their existence. Voldemort's downfall was, in part, due to his hubris, his belief that he was the only wizard capable of such dark magic, and that no one would ever unravel his secrets. But true masters of the dark arts, those who understood the gravity of tampering with the soul, would have likely taken greater precautions. Voldemort was powerful, but ultimately it was ego that got the better of him. Maybe other dark wizards who created Horcruxes avoided the potentially fatal but simple mistakes of scattering them carelessly or leaving behind obvious clues. And unlike Voldemort, they may have chosen to create only one Horcrux rather than recklessly dividing their soul into multiple fragments, damaging it to the point of severe destabilization. They may have also hidden their soul fragments in far less conspicuous locations, places that held no sentimental value. Voldemort was well known for his desire for grandeur, power, and recognition. He also had an ego that was completely out of control. And these are all important personality traits to consider, because this is exactly the type of person that would choose or associate his Horcruxes with significant locations or objects that held personal meaning to him, all indicative of his narcissistic and ego-driven nature. To him, it was somehow more satisfying to have his Horcruxes linked to his own history and achievements. It was also a slap in the face to those who were associated with the artifacts he ended up using, as he was able to desecrate their legacies by corrupting these precious objects with his dark magic. Horcruxes were Voldemort's trophies, but they also left a highly avoidable trail of breadcrumbs that led to his demise. So linger on this question. If there are any dark wizards that succeeded in creating Horcruxes, who's to say they aren't still out there, lurking in the shadows? Now for my last point on the topic. Why not the Death Eaters? On the topic of Horcrux creation, it's hard to ignore the Death Eaters. I mean, who would be a better next in line to create a Horcrux than one of Voldemort's most loyal and trusted servants? These were pureblood fanatics capable of nearly everything Voldemort was, that followed Voldemort to the grave. So is it unreasonable to think that they may have also been good candidates for Horcrux creation? And my first question is, did they even know about them? Well, according to the following quote from Voldemort, they at least knew something about what he had done. And then I ask myself, but how could they have believed I would not rise again? They, who knew the steps I took long ago to guard myself against mortal death. He says it right here, who knew the steps I took. So surely this suggested he'd educated them on the process. But if that was the case, why not allow them to create Horcruxes of their own? Why did none of them follow in his footsteps? Nearly all of his followers were capable of committing the same kinds of atrocities as him, so it's not unreasonable to think that they would also be able to go through with the same unthinkable Horcrux creation process. Here's what I think. I think that Voldemort told his followers about Horcruxes, but I don't think that he ever delved into the specifics. And I think the reason that he never delved into the specifics wasn't to hide the process from them, but because he didn't believe that they were strong enough to go through with it. Another thing worth considering here is that creating a Horcrux is one of the most difficult, extreme, and unknown magical processes known in the wizarding world. And if it was hard going for someone like Voldemort, one of the most innately powerful wizards of all time, then how can we reasonably expect that the Death Eaters would be successful? Why would he encourage and risk losing his followers to a process that he knew that they wouldn't be able to handle? He had very little to gain from teaching them that kind of magic. Voldemort felt that he was better than everyone, even his followers, and in a best-case scenario, one of his own followers would be rivaling his power, something he would never allow. And in a worst-case scenario, he'd have less servants. Voldemort thrived on control, ensuring that no one, not even his most loyal Death Eaters, could challenge his dominance. And if he had shared the secret of Horcrux creation, he would have risked elevating others to a level where they might one day oppose him. At the end of the day, even his closest allies like Bellatrix Lestrange were only ever tools to serve his ambitions, not equals. And his entire philosophy was built on the belief that only he was worthy of immortality. The very idea of another wizard, especially a subordinate, achieving the same was an insult to his ego. Attending Hogwarts school is a rite of passage for any young witch or wizard. But more than that, it's a privilege, an extraordinary opportunity reserved only for those born with magical abilities. For magical children coming from magical families, the process is fairly straightforward. They receive a Hogwarts acceptance letter in the mail that informs them of their acceptance to Hogwarts, along with a list of required textbooks and materials required for the upcoming school year. And for Muggleborns, that is, magical children born to non-magical families, Hogwarts dispatches a member of staff to travel to the home of said Muggleborn student so that the letter can be properly introduced and explained. And it's during this time that the staff member is given the behemoth task of explaining magic and the entire magical world to a Muggle who has no concept of either whatsoever. When the letter arrives at the home of a magical family, it's hardly a surprise. For generations, attending Hogwarts has been a tradition. Parents, grandparents, and even great-grandparents likely walked the same castle halls. Therefore, these families are well acquainted with the process and have likely been expecting a letter sometime near their child's 11th birthday. And whether or not they'll attend the school isn't even a question, it's simply assumed. For magical families, Hogwarts is more than just a school. It's a legacy, a cornerstone of their culture and heritage. And the thought of rejecting an acceptance letter to Hogwarts is almost unheard of. But one thing that's always dawned on me is how shocking it must be for the parents of Muggleborns to receive news of the magical world. And as if coming to terms with the existence of an entire magical world isn't difficult enough already, they're then expected to entrust the safety of their children to a bunch of complete strangers in a world that they not only have no understanding of, but have also just been introduced to. Oh, and let's not forget the cherry on top. Once your child leaves, you're expected to keep the whole thing a secret. Don't tell your friends, your neighbors, or anyone else, because the magical world doesn't exist as far as the rest of society is concerned. Given how difficult it must be for the parents of Muggleborn students to come to terms with this reality, I'd be willing to bet that there has been more than one instance of parents refusing, at least initially, to send their child to the school. After all, what good parent wouldn't worry about sending their child off to an unfamiliar, hidden world filled with unknown dangers and rules they don't understand? I know my mum would take issue, at least until she learns a bit more about it. Therefore, today I want to discuss the topic of parents refusing to send their children to Hogwarts, unpacking whether it's possible to actually refuse, and if they do, taking a look at what the future might hold for their magical child. Let's dive into it. The first example that comes to mind when discussing the topic of refusing to send a child to Hogwarts is, of course, Harry Potter and his horrible aunt and uncle. From the moment Harry's first acceptance letter arrived, Vernon and Petunia Dursley did everything in their power to prevent him from attending the school. They ripped up his letters, boarded up the mail slot, and even fled to a desolate shack on a rock in the middle of the sea, all in a desperate attempt to keep Harry from entering the magical world. "Haven't I told you he's not going?" he hissed. He's going to Stonewall High, and he'll be grateful for it. I've read those letters, and he needs all sorts of rubbish, spell books and wands, and their motives, of course, were rooted in their deep-seated resentment of magic and their irrational fear of anything that challenged their perfectly normal lives. And instead of being celebrated for being magic, the Dursleys hated Harry for it. In fact, they hated any and all things that weren't normal. Petunia held the belief that her parents preferred her magical sister to her, which forever made her despise the entire wizarding world. And when Vernon and Petunia met, Petunia confessed to Vernon that her sister was a witch, which led to them bonding over her being a freak. They unequivocally despised the wizarding world, and they did not want Harry to attend. However, despite their refusal to send Harry to Hogwarts, it would seem that the magical world wouldn't take no for an answer, as eventually Hagrid personally delivers Harry's letter to him. "If he wants to go, a great muggle like you won't stop him," growled Hagrid. "Stop Lily and James Potter's son going to Hogwarts? You're mad. His name's been down ever since he was born. He's off to the finest school of witchcraft and wizardry in the world. 7 years there, and he won't know himself. He'll be with youngsters of his own sort for a change, and he'll be under the greatest headmaster Hogwarts ever had, Albus Dumbledore." Based on this information, it's reasonable to assume that Hogwarts, and presumably the Ministry of Magic, has the power and authority to override the wishes of a child's legal guardians, effectively forcing them to allow the child to attend the school. But I'm not sure this effectively answers the question because Harry had such extenuating circumstances. Harry was the boy who lived, the boy of prophecy, of legend, and it's entirely possible that his importance to wizarding society was what enabled Hogwarts and the Ministry to take such drastic measures to ensure his attendance. Harry wasn't just any magical child, he was the boy who defeated Voldemort, a symbol of hope and resistance for the entire wizarding community. I also wonder whether Dumbledore played a personal role in ensuring that Harry attended Hogwarts. As someone who is fully aware of the prophecy and its implications, Dumbledore undoubtedly recognized the critical importance of Harry fulfilling his destiny and ultimately defeating Voldemort. Therefore, it's completely possible that Dumbledore leveraged his authority as the headmaster of Hogwarts to override the Dursleys' resistance. Because Harry's situation was so unique, it's hard to determine if this was the norm. I can't imagine that Hogwarts or the Ministry would intervene as forcefully as they did with Harry for just any old Muggle-born. I mean, can you picture Hagrid busting down the door of some random Muggle's small cottage in rural England to hand-deliver a Hogwarts letter? It seemed like that might be problematic. But if that isn't the case, what would happen? As it happens, J.K. Rowling has discussed this before, although it was in the early 2000s, and she has of course since contradicted herself. Everyone who shows magical ability before their 11th birthday will automatically gain a place at Hogwarts. There is no question of not being magical enough. You are either magical or you are not. There is no obligation to take up the place. However, a family might not want their child to attend Hogwarts. In the above passage, she reveals that parents of magical children do have a choice in the matter. However, there are a number of issues with this. The first issue that comes to mind is that a child without a magical education does not have any control over their magic, and magic is known to do all sorts of weird things when it isn't harnessed properly. Before Hogwarts, and sometimes even early in their studies, magical children are inherently prone to accidental, uncontrolled magic, which is often triggered by strong emotions like anger, fear, or confusion. This magic, which acts as a form of self-defense, can manifest in unpredictable and sometimes dangerous ways. There are plenty of examples of this in the series. Harry Potter, for example, unknowingly performed numerous acts of accidental magic before attending the school. He turned his teacher's wig blue, he shrunk one of Dudley's oversized sweaters when Aunt Petunia tried to force him to wear it, and even found himself on the school roof after being chased by Dudley and his gang. He also managed to regrow his hair overnight after Aunt Petunia gave him a dreadful haircut with kitchen scissors, and in one well-documented incident, Harry spoke to a snake at the zoo and unintentionally made the glass of its enclosure vanish. And without proper guidance, I suspect that these instances of accidental magic would only escalate, becoming increasingly dangerous for both the child and everyone around them. They need to attend magical school so that they can learn how to channel this magic, and I don't believe there's any other way to achieve this. And in the event that the magic is suppressed or the child is told not to do magic, things can get even worse. In the Fantastic Beasts films, we learn that suppressing one's magical abilities from a young age can lead to a dangerous buildup of magical energy, ultimately creating what we now know as an Obscurus, aka the manifestation of the young witch or wizard's repressed energy. The first example of an Obscurial, a wizard who had developed an Obscurus in the series, was Credence Barebone. Traditionally, Obscurials are young witches or wizards that are physically or emotionally abused to the point that they feel the need to repress their magic and hide their abilities. This repression is directly related to trauma experienced as a result of their magic and a development of hatred, fear, or shame in regard to their powers. And in the event that a Muggle-born's parent is so against magic that they refuse to send their child to school, I'd imagine that the likelihood of their child developing an Obscurus would be pretty high. I met one in Sudan 3 months ago. There used to be more of them, but they still exist. Before wizards went underground, and we were still being hunted by Muggles, young wizards and witches sometimes tried to suppress their magic to avoid persecution. Instead of learning to harness or to control their powers, they developed what was called an Obscurus. And the problem with an Obscurial is that they're extremely unpredictable. They are largely controlled by a powerful parasitic magical force that has an immense capacity for harm. In fact, most Obscurials don't live past their preteen years. Throughout the Harry Potter series, we only ever hear of one witch who could, retrospectively, be labelled as an Obscurial, and that's Ariana Dumbledore. And though it hasn't been confirmed, the explanation of her illness fits the description to a T. After being traumatized by an attack from Muggle boys, Ariana was left unable to control her abilities, which eventually led to a magical explosion that accidentally killed her mother. So you can see the issue with this. Bearing all of this in mind, I really can't imagine a world where Hogwarts and or the Ministry of Magic would allow this sort of thing to happen. Leaving magical children under the supervision of their non-magical parents would simply be far too much of a risk to both the Muggle and wizarding populations. But beyond safety, uncontrolled magic also threatens the larger wizarding community by risking exposure to Muggles. Violations of the Statute of Secrecy, the cornerstone of the magical world's protection, occur when magic is witnessed by non-magical individuals. Therefore, a Muggle-born child being left to accidentally levitate objects or cause explosions in a public place would directly jeopardize the secrecy that the wizarding world has worked so hard to maintain. This is precisely why institutions like Hogwarts are so vital. They don't just teach children how to wield magic, they also provide the structure, discipline, and understanding necessary to control it. And for these reasons, I think it probably is mandatory for the parents of any magical child to send them to Hogwarts. Now the question is, how is this enforced? I think that a key factor to focus on here is that the Statute of Secrecy is maintained due to the efforts of both sides. Despite the Muggle and Wizarding World's prominent division, there are some key Muggle figures that do know about all that is magical, and one such individual happens to be the head of the Muggle government, the Muggle Prime Minister. Traditionally, the British Prime Minister is informed about the existence of the Wizarding World on the night of their appointment. Occasionally, they would have meetings with their Wizarding World counterpart, the Minister for Magic, to discuss matters that could affect both the Wizarding and Muggle worlds, such as notable events like the escape of Sirius Black, the mass breakout from Azkaban, and the return of Lord Voldemort. And if there were any incidents where magic and the Muggle world collided in a way that couldn't be easily explained, the Prime Minister would work with the British Ministry of Magic's Office of Misinformation to create a believable cover-up story. In a previous video, I proposed the theory that the Muggle Prime Minister, being an inside man with significant authority, likely plays a key role in creating and upholding legislation designed to discreetly cover up the existence of children attending a magical school like Hogwarts. This would help the families of Muggleborns explain the absence of their children to other family members, neighbors, and government agencies. However, in this role, I would also expect the Muggle Prime Minister to play a part in facilitating the process of ensuring that magical children born to Muggle families end up attending Hogwarts. As we've already addressed, we know that in the case of Muggleborns, Hogwarts dispatches a member of staff to travel to the home of said Muggleborn student so that Hogwarts can be properly introduced and explained. However, if the parents remain resistant to the idea, it's plausible that a highly confidential branch of the Muggle government might step in to help resolve the situation. After all, maintaining the separation between the magical and non-magical worlds is crucial for the safety and stability of both communities. I think that parents might be far less resistant to the idea of sending their child away if the government intervenes and helps to convince them that all of it, Hogwarts, magic, etc., is legitimate. But as far as preventing their child from being sent away, I really don't think they have much choice in the matter. Before we close out this video, I do want to address one final issue. What happens if the parents are on board, but the child doesn't want to attend? If the child in question happened to be, for example, a young version of Vernon Dursley, someone who is about as opposed to magic as you can get, I imagine you'd have quite a difficult time getting him to attend. However, in this instance, I imagine things would unfold similarly to how the Muggle world enforces mandatory education, requiring parents to ensure their children attend school or receive proper schooling. Just as Muggle parents are required by law to ensure their children receive schooling, the Wizarding world likely has its own regulations to ensure that young witches and wizards receive the magical education necessary to control their abilities and integrate into society. Therefore, if the child was adamantly opposed, I suspect that it would likely fall on both the parents and Hogwarts staff to convince the child of the necessity of attending. Hogwarts isn't just about learning charms and potions, it's about ensuring the safety of the child, their family, and the broader Wizarding world. And without proper training, their uncontrolled magic could cause significant harm or expose the magical community to Muggles, violating the statute of secrecy. Allowing a child not to attend the school just doesn't seem like a viable option under any circumstances. Let's just hope that, for the most part, everyone's on board. If we consider the darkest wizards in history, two names rise above the rest: Gellert Grindelwald and Lord Voldemort. And depending on the time period, both of these dark wizards brought the Wizarding world to its knees at one point or another. Grindelwald through manipulation and ideology, Voldemort through fear and destruction. Both men were brilliant, ruthless, and obsessed with power, and while both of their tyrannical regimes eventually fell at the hands of the good guys, I do often wonder what could have happened if they had teamed up. I mean, Voldemort and Grindelwald together? That's probably an unstoppable duo, even for Team Dumbledore. And it's not like this couldn't have happened, because their timelines did overlap. Grindelwald was still alive during both of Voldemort's rises to power, the First and Second Wizarding Wars. But somehow, during both of these occasions, he failed to bring Grindelwald on board. He freed Death Eaters and recruited dark witches, wizards, and creatures from around the globe. He built a massive army of followers. But for some reason, Grindelwald, who is arguably one of the most dangerous magical minds in history, was left alone to rot in Ermengarde. So my question is, why didn't they ever team up? And more specifically, why didn't Voldemort try to recruit him? Let's dive into it. For a decent chunk of the early 20th century, the name Grindelwald sent shivers down the spines of witches and wizards across the globe. He was a visionary turned tyrant, a dark wizard who didn't just crave power, but a complete reordering of the magical world. Under the banner of the greater good, Grindelwald led a brutal campaign across Europe, leaving behind a legacy of fear and fanaticism. But in the year 1945, Grindelwald's dreams of establishing a new world order for the greater good came crashing down when he was finally confronted and defeated by Albus Dumbledore. Their legendary duel, described by Elphias Doge as one of the greatest duels of all time, marked the end of Grindelwald's decades-long reign of terror, and though Dumbledore ended up the victor, as well as the new rightful owner of the Elder Wand, he notably spared Grindelwald's life. And instead of sending him to Azkaban, Grindelwald was instead imprisoned in Ermengarde, the very fortress he had constructed to house those who opposed him. The canon explanation is that Grindelwald was imprisoned in Ermengarde over Azkaban because of his ties to Austria, but I'm not entirely convinced this was the only reason. I think he was imprisoned there under the pretense of cruel irony, having to sit in the topmost prison cell of his own prison for the remainder of his existence, staring at the same walls that he built to house his own enemies. And for the better part of 53 years, Grindelwald sat alone in his cell, isolated, forgotten, and with virtually no human contact. That is, until Voldemort came calling. By the year 1998, Voldemort had become entirely consumed by his quest for the fabled Elder Wand. Convinced that it held the power to finally destroy Harry Potter, he began tracing the wand's dark and violent history. And through tortured confessions and fragmented memories, one name kept resurfacing: Gellert Grindelwald, the brilliant and ambitious young wizard who had once stolen the wand from the wandmaker Mikhail Grigorovich and used it to ignite a reign of terror across Europe. Voldemort's search eventually led him to Nurmengard, where Grindelwald had been imprisoned for over 5 decades. But despite being just a shadow of the dark wizard he once was, Grindelwald was still defiant. Voldemort came seeking answers. He demanded the wand, but instead of giving him what he wanted, Grindelwald chose to lie, and instead claimed that he never possessed the Elder Wand. Grindelwald originally stole the wand from wandmaker Mikhail Grigorovich in his youth. He believed it would help him bring about a new magical world order, one where wizards ruled over Muggles for the greater good. And true to his goal, Grindelwald was able to use the wand to launch a reign of terror across Europe that lasted decades. That is, until he was defeated by Dumbledore and the wand's allegiance shifted. For the next 50 years, the Elder Wand sat quietly in Dumbledore's possession. But when Dumbledore was disarmed by Draco Malfoy, its loyalty passed, first to Draco and later to Harry, who disarmed Draco himself. Unbeknownst to Voldemort, the wand no longer belonged to the one he assumed, Severus Snape, and Grindelwald, he knew that. But instead of revealing the truth, he chose to resist. And I think that this interaction in particular gives us a lot of insights into why this particular partnership could have never possibly worked. On paper, it almost feels like Grindelwald should have helped Voldemort. After all, the two shared quite a bit in common. Both were extraordinarily gifted, heavily leveraged the dark arts to achieve their ends, and believed in a world where witches and wizards reigned supreme over Muggles. But in many other ways, they were completely different. And at the heart of their divide were deep ideological and personal differences that made any alliance between Grindelwald and Voldemort virtually impossible. Grindelwald cloaked his darkness in idealism. He preached about the greater good, rallying followers not just through fear, but through belief. Belief in a better world shaped by magical superiority. His goal was to establish a new magical order, one in which wizards would rule over Muggles, not out of hatred, but under the belief that it was their responsibility to lead. Grindelwald saw this as necessary for achieving what he called the greater good, a world where magical dominance would, in his eyes, ensure a better future for all. He envisioned a future of structured dominance, where magical governance replaced Muggle institutions, and the secrecy of the wizarding world was no longer needed. And he was manipulative, yes, but also charismatic, philosophical, and at times even restrained, convincing others that the ends justified the means. Voldemort, on the other hand, had no such mask. He didn't aspire to change the world. He wanted to control it. There was no higher vision, no ideology behind his cruelty. He craved power for its own sake, raw, eternal, and unquestioned. And his rise on both occasions was built on destruction, not reform. His goal wasn't to rule in place of Muggle governments, but to exist above all systems, feared and obeyed by all. So even though they were both dark wizards who sought supremacy, their goals were shaped by entirely different worldviews. And this certainly isn't the only area where they differed, or the only reason they never teamed up. Even if their goals had aligned, Voldemort's insane ego would have made any genuine alliance impossible. He demanded absolute loyalty and viewed himself as the pinnacle of magical power, someone who could not and should not be rivaled. So I can imagine the idea of sharing influence, especially with a once great wizard like Grindelwald, would have been intolerable to him. In Voldemort's eyes, there could only ever be one Dark Lord, and Grindelwald, despite his fall from power, still carried immense symbolic weight. He had followers, a legacy, and a kind of ideological charisma that Voldemort simply lacked. To bring Grindelwald into his ranks would have been to invite a rival, someone who might split loyalties or question his rule, and that was something Voldemort could never allow. Even his most trusted Death Eaters were kept in line through fear and cruelty, not respect. A man like Grindelwald, who inspired belief, not just obedience, would have been a threat to that fragile order. And for Voldemort, any risk of divided loyalty, even the perception of it, would have been enough to discard the idea entirely. Grindelwald's past partnership with Dumbledore, on the other hand, suggests that he may have worked alongside another powerful figure if their visions aligned. But Voldemort, I don't think he would have accepted anything less than total dominance. Another reason this partnership would have never worked is made abundantly clear in the one and only interaction we witness between them. By the time Voldemort visits Ermengarde, Grindelwald has already been defeated, fair and square, and is now serving out his sentence in silence. But more than that, he seems to have accepted his fate. Grindelwald was more than powerful enough to escape Ermengarde, especially in a 5-decade time period, but he never left, and that's because he didn't want to leave. It's my personal belief that after losing to Dumbledore fair and square, Grindelwald simply accepted his penance. It's also possible that, after being defeated and imprisoned, he may have finally understood that what he had always done in the pursuit of achieving the greater good was not necessarily the right course of action. Grindelwald may have been an evil dark wizard, but he always rationalized his own behavior because he felt that what he was doing was best for wizardkind as a whole. He didn't blindly seek out power for no reason, like Voldemort. And so, Grindelwald stayed in Ermengarde to contemplate the decisions that he had made during his life and pay his penance. And he ended up spending 53 years of his life there before eventually being murdered by Voldemort. The emaciated figure stirred beneath its thin blanket and rolled over toward him, eyes opening in a skull of a face. The frail man sat up, great sunken eyes fixed upon him, upon Voldemort, and then he smiled. Most of his teeth were gone. "So, you have come. I thought you would, one day. But your journey was pointless. I never had it. You lie." As Harry spoke, his scar burned worse than ever, and for a few seconds he looked down, not upon the Wandmaker, but on another man who was just as old, just as thin, but laughing scornfully. "Kill me then, Voldemort. I welcome death, but my death will not bring you what you seek. There is so much you do not understand." He felt Voldemort's fury, but as Hermione screamed again, he shut it out, returning to the cellar and the horror of his own present. At once, Harry's scar felt as though it had split open again. His true surroundings vanished. He was Voldemort, and the skeletal wizard before him was laughing toothlessly at him. He was enraged at the summons he felt. He had warned them. He had told them to summon him for nothing less than Potter. "Kill me then," demanded the old man. "You will not win. You cannot win. That wand will never, ever be yours." And Voldemort's fury broke. A burst of green light filled the prison room, and the frail old body was lifted from its hard bed and then fell back, lifeless. And Voldemort returned to the window, his wrath barely controllable. Despite facing the most formidable dark wizard in history, and the only dark wizard more powerful and dangerous than himself while being defenseless, Grindelwald still refused to divulge the whereabouts of the Elder Wand. And I think that this was partially due to his loyalty to Dumbledore. Being imprisoned for so many years had changed Grindelwald. Decades of isolation, stripped of power, followers, and influence, had forced him to confront the reality of what he'd done, and who he'd become. By the time Voldemort stood before him, Grindelwald was no longer the fiery revolutionary who had once dreamed of reshaping the world. He was older, wiser, humbled by defeat, and haunted by the consequences of his actions. I suspect that in Voldemort, Grindelwald saw a reflection of his own misguided younger self. And so, in his final moments, he didn't just resist Voldemort out of pride, he acted on two fronts. First, as an old man seeking penance for the damage he had caused, and second, as a final protector of the very world he'd once tried to dominate. Their very brief exchange reveals a Grindelwald who, in his old age, had gained a level of perspective and remorse, something Voldemort was incapable of understanding. And I think that it speaks volumes about why the two dark wizards could never truly have stood side by side. And so ultimately, their paths were never meant to diverge in this way. Voldemort never sought Grindelwald's help because he didn't believe he needed it. By the time he rose to power, he saw himself as the apex of magical evolution, immortal, unstoppable, and unrivaled. The very idea of reaching out to another powerful dark wizard, particularly one who had already been publicly defeated, would have felt beneath him. His obsession with control and dominance also wouldn't have left any room for shared power or rival influence. Grindelwald, despite his fallen status, still carried weight. His name, his ideology, and his ability to inspire loyalty could have easily disrupted the fragile obedience Voldemort maintained through fear. To recruit Grindelwald would be to risk dissent within his ranks, to offer a stage to a man who might attract followers not through threats, but through belief. And even if Voldemort had reached out, Grindelwald would have refused. The man we see in Ermengarde is no longer the revolutionary of his youth. He's reflective, burdened by the weight of his past, and, at least in part, repentant. Grindelwald may have been a dark wizard, but he was also a thinker, a strategist, a man with a cause, however flawed. Voldemort was chaos given form, a tyrant driven by fear, bloodlust, and a hatred for death itself. Their failure to unite wasn't some overlooked strategic misstep. It was a reflection of who they were at their core. It stemmed from deep ideological divergence, incompatible worldviews, and a profound mutual distrust. And in the end, their separation may have spared the wizarding world from a darkness far greater than either could conjure alone. By the time we finished Prisoner of Azkaban, we're meant to believe that Sirius Black was innocent of the crimes for which he was accused. For those who might be a little fuzzy on the details, Sirius wasn't just some random fugitive. He was Harry's godfather, a loyal member of the Order of the Phoenix, and once the closest friend of Harry's father, James Potter. And as we get closer to the end of the book film, it's finally revealed to Harry that the true traitor was Peter Pettigrew, not Sirius. It was Pettigrew who had betrayed James and Lily to Voldemort. It was Pettigrew who had faked his own death. And it was Pettigrew who had framed Sirius for the murder of 12 Muggles in broad daylight. Before we as readers or Harry learned the truth, the version of Sirius we were given was that of a dangerous, half-mad fugitive, the first wizard to ever escape from Azkaban, a man believed to have murdered 13 people with a single curse, and someone whose very name could strike fear into the wizarding population. And after these initial revelations of Sirius's innocence come to light, Harry's relationship with Sirius blossoms almost overnight. I'd argue a little too quickly. In a matter of pages, Sirius goes from the man who betrayed my parents to the godfather I never had, with Harry seemingly almost immediately ready to drop the Dursleys behind and go and live with him, although we know he couldn't do that. But here's my question. If Sirius was truly innocent, why didn't he act like it? Why did so many of his choices, from the moment of his arrest to his escape and eventual return, seem to confirm the image of a dangerous, unstable man? He lurked around in his Animagus form in the dead of night, he ripped up portraits at Hogwarts, and most notably, he looked absolutely insane in his mugshot taken for Azkaban, the same image that circulated the wizarding world after his escape. Canon sort of explains this, but I'm not totally convinced by the answers we're given. Let's dive into it. To kick things off, I want to take a look at the many instances of Sirius acting like a guilty man. The first and perhaps most significant being his Azkaban mugshot. When we're first shown this image in Prisoner of Azkaban, it's not just a photo. It's a piece of propaganda. It's the visual that the Ministry and the Daily Prophet plaster everywhere to cement the idea that Sirius Black is dangerous, unstable, and absolutely capable of murder. His hair is long, matted, and wild. His face is gaunt, almost skeletal from 12 years with the Dementors, and most striking of all are his eyes, staring out with an intensity that could really only be read as madness. It also doesn't help that in addition to all of this, he's smiling and laughing maniacally. Now, I know that everyone processes emotions differently, and trust me, there was a lot for him to process. But on a personal level, I'm not sure that as an innocent man, this is the image that I'd want to be projecting out to the world. I mean, laughing as an incredibly inappropriate and strange response to everything aside, Sirius was smart, and surely must have known how this would be perceived. I appreciate that in that moment, he likely wasn't thinking about optics, or how the press might spin it. But that manic grin and laugh of his really don't scream push to the point of breaking like we're led to believe, and instead paint a picture of a genuinely insane person that has actually lost their mind and more than likely committed murders. His expressions and behavior also sort of remind me of when Barty Crouch Jr. was exposed and put on trial after the First Wizarding War. And Barty Crouch Jr. was about as insane as they come. Oh yeah, and he was guilty. I bet the Daily Prophet must have had an absolute field day with that footage. And before you hop in and mention that this was a movieism, that's not entirely true. No, he's not laughing during the mugshot, but he is laughing when he's caught at the scene of the crime. "You don't know what you're talking about, Hagrid," said Fudge sharply. Nobody but trained hit wizards from the Magical Law Enforcement Squad would have stood a chance against Black once he was cornered. I was junior minister in the Department of Magical Catastrophes at the time, and I was one of the first on the scene after Black murdered all those people. I will never forget it. I still dream about it sometimes. A crater in the middle of the street, so deep it had cracked the sewer below. Bodies everywhere. Muggles screaming. And Black stood there laughing, with what was left of Pettigrew in front of him. A heap of blood-stained robes and a few fragments. And in the novel, Sirius's wanted poster describes him with a gaunt face and eyes mad with hatred. Combine that with the laughing, and we do actually get a fairly similar visual. The only difference is that the movie cranked it up to 11. Either way, it's not a good look. In defense of Sirius here, I should also mention that the witness to him laughing at the scene was Fudge, who isn't exactly the most credible. Fudge also mentioned himself that at the time he was only a junior minister in a minor department at the ministry, so it's possible that he embellished the story, making it sound more dramatic than it really was in order to get a bit more credit for having been there. And whether that detail was true or just theatre, it fed into a much larger narrative. Sirius Black as the unstable, violent madman who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Which brings me to the next best example that played perfectly into that image, the night he slashed the portrait of the fat lady. If Sirius wasn't actually a bad wizard, why on earth would he do this? To Harry and many others, this was just more proof that he was guilty of everything the Ministry claimed. By defacing the painting, which concealed the entrance to the Gryffindor common room, Sirius sent the entire student body, and Harry especially, into a panic. Even the fat lady herself described him as terribly deranged, and in the moment, that's exactly how it looked. Sirius's knack for looking guilty at all the wrong times was becoming a pattern, and another pattern of behavior that didn't do him any favors in the not guilty department was his repeated appearances in his Animagus form. Later on, after we learn more about Sirius and his Animagus form, it's not so ominous. He transforms into a cute black German shepherd. But in the early days, before we knew the truth, his Animagus form carried a very different weight. To the wizarding public, a Grim was considered an omen of death, and to the students, this dark shape lurking on the edge of the Forbidden Forest or in the shadows of the Quidditch stand was downright terrifying. He was spotted watching Harry play from the sidelines, and even seen prowling near the castle in the dead of night. Harry shouldered the firebolt, and he and Ron walked out of the shadowy stadium, discussing the firebolt's superbly smooth action, its phenomenal acceleration, and its pinpoint turning. They were halfway toward the castle, and Harry, glancing to his left, saw something that made his heart turn over. A pair of eyes, gleaming out of the darkness. And just then it emerged, a gigantic, shaggy black dog, moving stealthily across the lawn, Crookshanks trotting at its side. Harry stared. What did this mean? If Crookshanks could see the dog as well, how could it be an omen of Harry's death? "Ron!" Harry hissed. "Ron, wake up!" Okay, so by now you've got a pretty good idea of what I mean. That Sirius, on many fronts, was not doing himself any favors as far as maintaining the appearance of innocence. But there are some explanations for all of this. As far as the incident with the fat lady, the truth is that Sirius was simply hunting Peter Pettigrew, and the portrait got in the way. Still boiling over from Peter's betrayal of James, Lily, and himself, and having endured a decade in Azkaban under the constant torment of Dementors, Sirius was nowhere near his best frame of mind. Add in the fact that he'd spent many of those years in his Animagus form to shield himself from the Dementors' effects, and it's easy to see how he might have been, let's say, a little feral. As a former Gryffindor, Sirius knew the common room entrance was concealed behind the fat lady's portrait, but no longer being a student, he had no way of knowing the password. Believing Peter was hiding inside in his rat form and already consumed by years of rage and frustration, Sirius likely snapped, slashing at the portrait in a desperate bid to get in. It didn't do much for his image, but you've got to give him a little leniency here, as he had just spent 12 years in the world's worst prison for a crime he didn't even commit. The canon explanation for him being caught maniacally laughing at the scene of the crime, however, is not quite as direct. Unfortunately, when Sirius was initially caught for his alleged crimes, he sort of sealed his own fate, as instead of pleading his innocence, his first reaction was to burst out laughing. With a pile of dead muggles and the index finger of his friend in front of him, Sirius should have taken this situation very seriously. But in times of extreme stress, it's hard to predict how one will react. And the common explanation here is that Sirius, unable to process everything that had just happened, had a mental breakdown. The Potters were dead, he had just witnessed the murder of 12 muggles, his childhood friend Pettigrew had changed allegiance, and from that point onward, he would have to live knowing that it was he who made the recommendation to make Pettigrew secret keeper. Sirius was possibly the main reason that the Potters had died, and he couldn't process everything that had just happened. Because Sirius and the Potters had never revealed to anyone else the change in Secret Keeper, from the outside it honestly looked as though Sirius had first given up the Potters' location to Voldemort, then murdered a bunch of muggles, then killed Pettigrew. Things didn't look good for Sirius, and when Fudge showed up to the scene of the crime and witnessed Sirius laughing, he looked like a crazed, murderous lunatic that was truly befitting of the crimes that had just been committed. But of course, the canon explanation isn't that Sirius was laughing out of crazed, bloodthirsty delight in what had just happened. He wasn't reveling in murder. He was laughing because, in that instant, the sheer absurdity and hopelessness of his situation hit him all at once. Peter had slipped through his fingers, his best friends were dead, and now, standing over the wreckage, Sirius knew the truth would never be believed. That laugh, in context, wasn't joy. It was a breaking point. A release of every ounce of rage, grief, and disbelief he'd been carrying. And while it might have looked defiant, it was in truth an expression of pure despair, a complete emotional collapse. However, to anyone watching, and especially in the retellings that followed, it looked exactly like the unhinged reaction of a man who'd just committed mass murder and didn't regret it for a second. Now, before we continue any further, I do want to explicitly mention that I do believe that Sirius Black was innocent, and that the version of events we were given in the books is in fact accurate. However, there are some unusual aspects of his behavior that I want to explore further. Given what had transpired, I suppose it's easy to accept that he'd completely lost his mind. But if we step back and look at Sirius as a whole, that picture doesn't quite add up. And I get it, we all have our breaking points, but I think that Sirius's mental resolve was much stronger than this moment would indicate. In the same book, it's revealed that Sirius was able to muster the necessary mental strength to challenge the draining effects of the Dementors in Azkaban, and this is not something we should just gloss over. Dementors have the power to strip away every happy memory you possess, leaving you with nothing but your worst moments, played on repeat until you lose the will to live. Most prisoners in Azkaban either went mad or wasted away within months. But Sirius, he went 12 long years, and he didn't just endure, he kept enough clarity of thought to eventually escape. It was as if someone had lit a fire in my head, and the Dementors couldn't destroy it. It wasn't a happy feeling, it was an obsession, but it gave me strength, it cleared my mind, and he explains that it was his obsession, clinging to his innocence and his mission, that helped him maintain that mental clarity. And to me, this reveals the mindset of a focused and resourceful survivor, not a broken one. As far as what this means for Sirius laughing, I'm still not sure. Maybe I'm giving him more credit than he deserves, but I think all of this is worth considering. And one thing I know for certain is that in the case of Sirius, no one is more guilty than Cornelius Fudge. It was Fudge who found him at the scene of the crime, and it was Fudge's account that fast-tracked Sirius straight to Azkaban. No trial, no questioning, nothing. And given Fudge's bottom-feeder nature, I'd be willing to bet serious galleons that he embellished Sirius's behavior to serve his own ends, painting himself as the capable junior official who apprehended the ministry's most dangerous criminal. For a man as politically ambitious as Fudge, Sirius Black was the perfect stepping stone, a ready-made villain whose supposed madness and violent outburst could be retold in dramatic detail, each version making Fudge seem more competent and decisive. The truth, that Sirius never had a chance to defend himself, was far less convenient for his career narrative. Imagine a creature that doesn't die, no one can kill, and thrives on misery and despair. A creature that can't be reasoned with, can't be bribed, and whose presence alone makes human beings relive their worst moments. Alright, now imagine thousands of them. Not a great situation to deal with, right? But unfortunately, this is precisely what the Wizarding World, specifically the Ministry of Magic, had to deal with after the fall of Voldemort. For many years, the Ministry put Dementors to work. In fact, their arrangement with these creatures dates back to 1718, when the newly elected Minister for Magic, Damocles Rowell, took office. Rowell saw the Dementors not as a threat to be eliminated, but as an asset, something he could exploit to guard Azkaban and keep prisoners in line. Since the prison needed watchmen, Rowell reasoned that using non-beings like Dementors would spare the lives of wizarding guards. And while at first the wizarding community protested the idea of employing such foul creatures, that attitude soon shifted when the breakout rate at Azkaban dropped to virtually zero. Slowly but surely, the objections faded, and people came to accept the system. Dementors became the perfect guards for Azkaban, ensuring that no prisoner would ever escape. But this arrangement wasn't one-sided, as in exchange the Dementors wanted just one thing: free reign to feed on the emotions of the prisoners within its walls. And when the Ministry effectively handed them a captive population of prisoners, it created a system where everyone seemed to benefit, except the souls being drained. And this raised some serious ethical considerations. Was it truly justice to condemn someone not only to imprisonment, but to a slow, inevitable decay of the mind and spirit? To have every happy memory stripped away until nothing remained but emptiness and despair? For the Ministry, the trade-off seemed worth it. The Dementors got to feed, the public felt safer, and even the darkest witches and wizards now had a reason to think twice before breaking wizarding law. Facing a Dementor was a fate worse than death itself, and the Ministry knew it. And while the Ministry may have justified all of this as a necessary evil, it blurred the line between justice and cruelty, and for a long time, this arrangement worked well. However, the big problem with Dementors is that they'll provide their services to the highest bidder, whoever can provide them with the most souls. And when the Second Wizarding War reached its climax at the height of Voldemort's second rise to power, he had effectively overthrown the Ministry and recruited Dementors for his own cause. The rest of us sleep less soundly in our beds, Cornelius, knowing that you've put Lord Voldemort's most dangerous supporters in the care of creatures who will join him the instant he asks them, said Dumbledore. They will not remain loyal to you, Fudge. Voldemort can offer them much more scope for their powers and their pleasures than you can. With the Dementors behind him and his old supporters returned to him, you will be hard-pressed to stop him regaining the sort of power he had 13 years ago. And while the good guys were able to eventually defeat Voldemort and begin to regain control of the wizarding world, restoring order wasn't so easy. By this point, the Dementors had gone against the partnership they had maintained with the Ministry since 1718, and instead pledged their services to Voldemort. Basically, they could no longer be trusted, and this left the Ministry with the monumental task of deciding what to do with an entire population of Dementors. After Voldemort's defeat, Kingsley Shacklebolt was the first man to step up and serve as the new Minister for Magic. Kingsley was a unique minister in that he was actually a good person, and this meant that, whether the Dementors had faltered in their loyalty or not, it's unlikely that he would have continued using their services at Azkaban. To him, the very idea of employing creatures that fed on human misery was incompatible with a just and fair wizarding society. And so one of his earliest and most significant reforms was to end the Ministry's reliance on Dementors altogether. Rather than keeping them on as prison guards, Kingsley had them driven out of Azkaban, finally breaking the centuries-old arrangement that had begun under Damocles Rowell. From that point on, human auras and wardens were assigned to maintain order, bolstered by defensive enchantments strong enough to keep even the darkest prisoners contained. HarryPotter.com reinforces this. Under Kingsley Shacklebolt, Azkaban was purged of Dementors. While it remains in use as a prison, the guards are now auras, who are regularly rotated from the mainland. There has been no breakout since this new system was introduced. But this reform raised another issue. If the Dementors were no longer allowed to surround Azkaban, where would they go? Azkaban was really the perfect place to keep them. Not only did it solve the issues of ensuring that prisoners stayed within its walls, but it also kept the Dementors far away from the wizarding mainland. Azkaban was located far out in the middle of the ocean, and it served as a naturally isolated fortress that prevented them from roaming freely among the general population. It was also their birthplace. The dark wizard Acristus, who lived during the 15th century, was the first to make use of the island. A practitioner of the darkest kinds of magic, Acristus built a fortress there and conducted horrific experiments, often luring Muggle sailors to their deaths. And it was from his dark magic the Dementors first gathered, drawn to the pain and suffering that emanated from the island. When Christus eventually died, the stronghold remained, haunted and saturated with such dark energy that Dementors continued to thrive there, even without him. By the time the Ministry officially converted the fortress into a prison in the 18th century, the Dementors had already made Azkaban their home. The Ministry's deal with them wasn't about bringing them in, it was about taking advantage of the fact that they were already there, in numbers too great and with power too dangerous to eradicate. But once Kingsley made the decision to cut ties with them, that containment was lost, and all of a sudden the Wizarding World was faced with the prospect of an entire population of Dementors with no prison to anchor them. Without Azkaban's walls to bind their feeding, they could go anywhere, drifting toward places steeped in human suffering, multiplying in times of conflict, and spreading despair far beyond what the Ministry could directly control. And this brings up a larger, more unsettling truth about Dementors. They cannot actually be destroyed. J.K. Rowling herself explained, "You cannot destroy Dementors, though you can limit their numbers if you eradicate the conditions in which they multiply, i.e. despair and degradation. This means that no spell, potion, or curse can wipe them out. They are classified by the Ministry as non-beings, not truly alive, but not truly dead either. Amortal. They exist as raw magical presences born from suffering itself. There are even competing theories as to how Dementors reproduce. Some suggest they grow like a fungus under conditions of despair, hopelessness, and darkness, multiplying in environments steeped in misery. Others argue they literally breed, with Cornelius Fudge once warning in Half-Blood Prince that Dementors were breeding, their unchecked spread causing unnatural mist to choke the skies. Regardless of which is true, the outcome is the same. The more darkness and suffering in the world, the more Dementors appear. And though the Patronus charm is the only known defense against them, it doesn't actually kill or even harm them, it merely drives them away. And with Kingsley kicking them out of Azkaban, one of the greatest post-war questions was, what happened to the Dementors? The truth is, we don't have any definitive answers. J.K. Rowling never tells us exactly what became of the Dementors after Kingsley's reform, nor does any Wizarding World resource. What we do know, however, is that Dementors can't simply be destroyed or wished away. Fortunately, I've got a couple of theories for what may have happened to them. First of all, I think that it's highly unreasonable to assume that the Ministry would allow thousands of dangerous, unkillable creatures to freely wreak havoc across the Wizarding World, especially a Ministry led by someone reasonable like Shacklebolt. Therefore, I suspect that the Ministry likely relocated them to a remote, desolate part of the world, an uninhabited island or wasteland where their presence would pose less of a threat. My best guess would be another small remote island, something similar to Azkaban in its isolation, but without the constant flow of prisoners. An unmarked landmass far from shipping routes, perhaps cloaked in enchantments to ward off both Muggles and wizards alike. A place like this would allow the Ministry to keep the Dementors out of sight and out of mind, while also preventing them from wandering freely across the mainland. Of course, this wouldn't be a perfect solution, as it's very possible that the Dementors would still be feeding, multiplying, and growing stronger in the shadows. But from the Ministry's perspective, relocating them to some forgotten rock in the middle of the sea may have simply been the path of least resistance. Dementors simply aren't conquerable. They can't truly be destroyed, and imprisoning them in any traditional sense is impossible. The best anyone can hope for is to keep them concentrated in one place, somewhere they can at least be tracked, monitored, and contained. The only real tool the Ministry has that they can use on Dementors is the Patronus charm. A Patronus is a good defense against Dementors because it produces a positive energy force that represents everything that Dementors aren't. The Patronus represents hope, happiness, survival, and purity. And as the Patronus does not feel despair or hopelessness as a human might, the Dementors can't hurt it and are repelled by its presence. If all of the Dementors were concentrated in a single location, it really isn't hard to imagine the Ministry using Patronus magic as a kind of barrier, warding them in and preventing them from ever leaving the island. Of course, this would require a lot of manpower, and I don't suppose too many people would raise their hand for the job of guarding a small island full of thousands of Dementors. But this is where the Patronus charm's brilliance really shines through. You see, there are two types of Patronus charms, an incorporeal one, like we see most Hogwarts students manage in their training, and a corporeal one, which takes on a distinct animal form and has far greater strength. Casting an incorporeal Patronus is certainly a good method of keeping Dementors at bay, but its real drawback is that you actually need to be in the presence of the Dementor to cast the spell and ward them off. A corporeal Patronus, on the other hand, acts as a true guardian, an animal spirit that can move independently of the witch or wizard who cast it. And this is where its real brilliance lies. These Patronuses can be stationed at a distance, meaning they could guard the perimeter of a Dementor island without the constant physical presence of the witch or wizards themselves. It wouldn't make the Dementors disappear, but it could keep them penned in, and the bonus here is that no real witch or wizards would have to be put in harm's way. And while there's no way to confirm it, it's not hard to imagine that confining the Dementors to an island without a real food source could, over time, cause their numbers to dwindle. We know that they can't die in the traditional sense, but without a steady supply of despair to feed on, they might weaken, scatter, or even fade into something less dangerous over time. If Dementors really are generated by misery, degradation, and hopelessness, then depriving them of these things may serve as a strategy to starve them out. Cut off the despair, and their numbers dwindle. And it's not so much killing them as it is eroding the conditions of their existence. When Voldemort dies in the films, he disintegrates into thousands of pieces and blows away in the wind. And when he dies in the books, his body falls with a mundane finality, revealing something far more fitting. In the end, there is nothing grand or mythic about his death at all. He simply dies. But in the end, neither depiction of his death answers the real question. His body might fall or crumble, but that tells us nothing about what truly became of him. Not the man, not the flesh, but the part he tried hardest to protect. The part he mutilated in his quest for immortality. His soul. And today we're going to be unpacking this further and taking a closer look at what may have happened to the most mutilated soul in wizarding history. Let's dive into it. Now, this is certainly an interesting topic to tackle, because most people just sort of accept that Voldemort dies and that's it. There's even an underlying irony that Voldemort, in the books at least, dies a mortal death, simply collapsing on the floor. But if you really think about it, no actions are without their consequences, especially when you're one of the darkest wizards of all time that has made a habit out of experimenting with the worst kinds of dark magic imaginable. And in a magical world, dying doesn't mean you're exempt from facing the consequences of your actions. Dying isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. You still murdered countless people and split your soul into a bunch of pieces. And that means, that's right, you're going to have to face that eventually, even in death. The line between the living and the dead is unquestionably a blurry one in Harry Potter. This is reinforced by the prevalence of beings that skirt these two planes of existence. Ghosts and Dementors are some of the first that come to mind. And in the case of Voldemort, his fate sits at a strange intersection between mortality, metaphysics, and magical lore, an ending that is neither life, nor death, nor anything we would recognize as peace. And with these blurred lines, the topic of death, which is also a key thematic element in Harry Potter, becomes even more alluring. In fact, one of the main messages of the Harry Potter books is that death is not absolute. It's also reinforced that it's not anything we should be worrying about. We're continually reminded that death is simply a part of life, and that rather than obsessing over it, we should instead shift our focus on seeking love and friendship, enjoying the time that we do have. But the lesson the books teach surrounding the inevitability of death is one that never quite resonated with our immortality-obsessed antagonist. Rather than embrace life at its own pace, Voldemort devised all sorts of plans to achieve the ever-elusive goal of immortality. But understanding Voldemort's fate requires us to understand the soul not just as a metaphor, but also as a concrete magical component. The existence of a soul is a somewhat abstract concept, which means it's hard to define. However, the generally accepted concept of a soul is that it's a kind of immaterial spiritual essence, an actuating cause of an individual's life. It's what makes us tick, and it certainly has no scientific explanation. It's the soul that Dementors feed on, it's pieces of soul that Voldemort imparts into objects, and it's the soul that Avada Kedavra purportedly rips out of the body. The soul is what keeps our corporeal form earthbound, and that's why it plays a significant role in the conversation surrounding the wizarding afterlife. And in pursuit of immortality, Voldemort repeatedly carved pieces of that very soul away. Every major step in his rise came with a cost, not to his body, but to the thing meant to survive death. Killing is the catalyst that tears the soul, and Voldemort committed his first murder as a teenager. That act alone fractured him, but he didn't stop there. Each Horcrux required another killing, and Voldemort was more than willing to supply the bodies. And the damage didn't end with murder. He experimented with Horcrux creation, soul magic that only one wizard before him had successfully performed. He forced pieces of his essence into objects never meant to carry such a burden, stretching what remained of himself thinner and thinner. And even his resurrection ritual in the graveyard, which used blood, bone, and flesh to drag his soul back into a corporeal form, further destabilized whatever integrity it had left. Each time he tore his soul apart, the fragment left behind became weaker, smaller, and more malformed. And by the time of the Battle of Hogwarts, Voldemort wasn't a man with a damaged soul. He was a damaged soul wearing the shape of a man. Harry Potter very much perpetuates the idea that ultimately the physical body is merely a shell, a vessel that merely transports the vital life force within. And because the soul is immaterial, it exists forever. You can exist without your soul, you know, as long as your brain and heart are still working, but you'll have no sense of self anymore, no memory, no anything. There's no chance at all of recovery. You'll just exist as an empty shell, and your soul is gone forever, lost. And this is what makes soul magic the most forbidden branch of the dark arts. The soul is not meant to be touched. It's the core of a wizard's identity, the seat of memory, conscience, and continuity. When the soul is whole, death sorts the pieces out in a predictable way. The soul departs, and whatever comes next, be it an afterlife, another plane, or some great cosmic mystery, is entered intact. And unless you live a particularly cursed existence like Voldemort, then the soul won't be affected by death and the subsequent exit from the mortal realm. In fact, it seems as though, in most cases, quite the opposite happens, with the soul becoming vitalized or purified and reverting the individual back to their prime state. This is reinforced through Harry's interaction with the souls of his loved ones in the Forbidden Forest. Sirius was tall and handsome, and younger by far than Harry had seen him in life. He loped with an easy grace, his hands in his pockets and a grin on his face. Lupin was younger too, and much less shabby, and his hair was thicker and darker. He looked happy to be back in this familiar place, a scene of so many adolescent wanderings. In the case of Voldemort, however, he wasn't so lucky. This is shown through Harry's interaction with the broken remnant he encounters in King's Cross, a moment that finally reveals the true state of Voldemort's soul. Harry turned slowly on the spot, and his surroundings seemed to invent themselves before his eyes. He had spotted the thing that was making the noises. It had the form of a small, naked child curled on the ground, its skin raw and rough, flayed-looking, and it lay shuddering under a seat where it had been left, unwanted, stuffed out of sight, struggling for breath. Though many interpreted the child on the floor of King's Cross to be representative of the soul fragment expelled from Harry's body, it turns out it was actually representative of the current state of Voldemort's soul. What exactly was the mutilated, baby-like creature Harry saw at King's Cross in Chapter 35 of Hallows? I've been asked this a lot. It is the last piece of soul Voldemort possesses. The pathetic, whimpering creature Harry encounters isn't a vision or a metaphor. It isn't a hallucination brought on by near death. It is the literal condition of Voldemort's soul, stripped, wounded, and permanently deformed by the choices he made. In that moment, Rowling shows us exactly what remains of the Dark Lord when everything else is gone. Not power, not grandeur, not immortality, just suffering, frailty, and the consequences of a lifetime spent tearing himself apart. And where was Harry exactly when he encountered this highly damaged piece of Voldemort's soul? Well, Limbo, of course. It looked like King's Cross, but I promise you it wasn't. Limbo in many religions can be described as the border place between heaven and hell, a place where lost souls go before moving on to the afterlife. It's a place where one is neither dead nor alive, a place that's often perceived as a forgotten or ignored place. Many different religions and cultures view Limbo differently. However, one aspect of Limbo is consistent across all of them. It's not somewhere that you want to be. Most outline that Limbo is the place that a recently deceased person can make a choice, move on to the afterlife, or return to the world as a ghost, which is consistent with Harry Potter. But Rowling adds something darker. Limbo is also a place where a soul can be trapped if it is too damaged to move on. This is the crossroads Voldemort reaches, a liminal state where the normal machinery of death no longer works because the soul is too broken to function. This is why Voldemort's soul fragment doesn't move, doesn't speak, and doesn't grow. It's not that it's waiting, it's that it can't do anything else. Most souls arrive in this threshold state intact enough to choose their next step. Voldemort's, however, arrives so broken that the normal rules of death simply cannot apply to him. The scene at King's Cross is not just a symbolic representation of his downfall, it is the only moment in the series where we are shown, directly and without metaphor, what happens to a soul mutilated far beyond what the human condition was designed to endure. This is why Dumbledore calls soul splitting the supreme act of evil, not just because it kills, but because it unravels the very self. Voldemort's death wasn't peaceful, and it wasn't just final. It was metaphysical collapse. He had nothing left intact to carry on. For most witches and wizards, what comes after death is guided by choice, a fork in the road where a whole soul can either move on or remain behind as a ghost. But Voldemort never reaches that fork. His soul is so damaged, so incomplete, that the very processes that govern death can't function the way they're meant to. His fragment in Limbo doesn't wait, and doesn't decide. It simply exists in a state where decision is impossible. And this is where we need to zoom out and look at what death normally looks like in the wizarding world, because only by understanding what should have happened can we understand just how wrong Voldemort's fate really was. In most cases, death in the wizarding world is not an end, but a transition. A soul freed from its body continues to exist somewhere else. And in most cases, a wizard's soul chooses whether to remain as a ghost or move on. Nearly Headless Nick explains that ghosts are not trapped souls, but deliberate impressions made by wizards who fear death and cling to the world. This requires a soul stable enough to make a decision at the moment of passing. Lily and James moved on, Sirius passed beyond the veil without resistance, even Nick, who feared death too much to leave, had enough coherence to choose a half-life. All of this depends on the soul being whole. But what happens to a soul too damaged to transition? What happens when the very mechanism that allows a wizard to move on, the continuity of self, has been destroyed? This is the crossroads Voldemort ultimately reaches. Death cannot work properly on a soul that has been shattered. His soul wasn't coherent enough to imprint anything. He didn't pass on, he didn't remain, he simply broke. And that's precisely why Voldemort's fate is one of, well, actually, the most horrifying in the entire series. Because whether he disintegrated into 1,000 pieces or merely collapsed to the floor, it doesn't really matter. The physical spectacle of his end is irrelevant. What matters is that, at the moment of death, Voldemort had nothing left intact to carry him anywhere. No stable consciousness, no continuity of self, no full soul to make a choice or experience release. His body died like everyone else's, but his soul remained trapped in the wreckage he created. He feared death above all else. He saw it as a weakness, something to be conquered, but by trying to defeat it, he destroyed the one part of himself that could have endured it. In the end, Voldemort didn't just die, he was tormented for all of eternity. Lovely. But before we wrap up, there's one more interpretation worth considering. One that isn't explicitly confirmed in canon, but many fans find strangely poetic. It's the idea that Voldemort didn't just suffer because his soul was damaged. He suffered because every destroyed Horcrux magnified that damage back onto what remained of him. In this interpretation, each Horcrux Voldemort created didn't just hold a fragment of his soul, it held the trauma of the act that tore it loose. A magical scar. Horcruxes aren't simply containers, they're wounds. And when a wound like that is destroyed, it doesn't quietly disappear. It snaps shut violently. Canon gives us hints that Horcrux destruction is not a gentle process. The diary erupts as if something alive is being killed. The ring carries a deadly curse. The locket screams. The cup melts and writhes. The diadem releases a dark, corrupted essence. Each one dies as though something is being forcibly ripped out of it. According to this theory, the violent destruction of each Horcrux sends a kind of metaphysical recoil back into the last surviving fragment of Voldemort's soul, weakening it further every time. By the end of the Battle of Hogwarts, all of those violent echoes have collapsed into a single remnant, a remnant far too small, far too wounded, and far too overwhelmed to withstand even the smallest shock. This would explain why the creature Harry sees at King's Cross looks the way it does. Not merely mutilated, but overloaded with every wound Voldemort ever inflicted upon himself. 7 tearings, 7 murders, 7 violent destructions, all snapping back into one tiny, shuddering piece of soul. By this interpretation, Voldemort's fate isn't just worse than death. It's the ultimate consequence of a lifetime spent harming himself in the pursuit of power. By trying to divide his soul to become immortal, he ensured that, in the end, every piece of what he'd destroyed would return to him, magnified, amplified, and utterly impossible to escape. It is a form of immortality, in a way, but the kind no one would ever choose. When a young witch or wizard has no understanding of magic, they rely entirely on the way that it's taught to them. They copy sounds, they mimic gestures, and they perform rituals they barely understand. At Hogwarts, students mostly imitate what their professors demonstrate, and long before that, in magical homes, young witches and wizards often pick up bits of magic just by watching their parents. And by doing these things, they learn the shape of magic, but not the rules beneath it. They don't know why a wand must move a certain way, or why emotion matters just as much as language. They often don't know what happens when intent wavers, or when a spell is cast without conviction. They're given technique, not theory. They're taught how to do magic, but it's rarely explained why it works. But here's the thing about magic. It's wildly unpredictable. It isn't patient with mistakes, and it certainly doesn't forgive misunderstandings. Which means that sometimes, when the spell isn't quite right, it doesn't just not work, it actively pushes back. And when magic pushes back, there are consequences. Of course, not every spell fits this criteria. Some spells will just fizzle out or do nothing at all. But the focus of today's video will be on the spells that do push back, sometimes with dire, even horrific consequences. Let's dive into it. Number 1. Patronus. Now, I expect many of you might be thinking, the Patronus charm? Isn't that like the most innocuous, harmless spell of them all? And for the most part, you'd be right. But in truth, there is a dark side to the Patronus charm that is often overlooked. A Patronus charm is produced when a witch or wizard casts the spell Expecto Patronum. There are 2 types of Patronus charms, corporeal and incorporeal, and the type that the witch or wizard casts will depend on their experience, preference. The more basic form of the spell is the incorporeal Patronus, which assumes no animal form and simply resembles a burst of white vapor or smoke. And the more advanced form of the spell is the conjuring of a corporeal Patronus. Notably, the corporeal Patronus assumes the form of the witch or wizard's spirit animal, and varies extensively from witch to witch or wizard to wizard. It's also worth mentioning that there's no way to know what your Patronus is until you cast it. Casting a Patronus, specifically a corporeal Patronus, is said to be an impressive feat of magic. But interestingly, the issue here is not so much with the incantation or wand movement of the caster, but rather their heart. The best example of what happens when a Patronus goes wrong comes from the story of Ilias and Rexidian. There once was a wizard named Ilias, who lived in a quiet mountain village overshadowed by a dark presence. High above them stood the fortress of Rexidian, a black castle patrolled by Dementors. The villagers rarely saw the dark wizard himself, but his influence was always there, looming over the forest like a storm that never fully passed. When Ilias turned 17, he and his peers were taught the Patronus charm. Though shy and tongue-tied, he managed to conjure one, a tiny mouse. It was mocked as useless, and the elders advised him never to use it. But not long after, everything changed. Rexidian demanded a young villager named Eliana be given to him as a bride. Her family refused, and he retaliated. Dementors flooded the village, and the people fought back with their Patronuses. At first, wolves, boars, and bears of silver light held them off, but the swarm was too great. Their magic weakened, and the line faltered. Despite being ridiculed, Ilias ended up casting his Patronus, and the tiny mouse shone so brightly that the Dementors recoiled. It darted through the chaos and turned the tide. Furious, Rexidian entered the battle himself. Believing he could simply overpower Ilias, he attempted the same spell, treating it like a weapon instead of a reflection. And this is where everything fell apart. It's commonly believed that only the pure of heart can produce a Patronus. But in truth, a Patronus requires one thing above all: a memory so happy it can overpower fear. When Rixidian tried, the world witnessed for the first time what happens when a powerful but unworthy wizard attempts to summon one. Maggots burst from Rixidian's wand and devoured him alive. Not a corrupted animal, not a twisted shade. A spell that punished him. Instead of summoning a protective spirit, his magic revealed what he actually carried inside him: decay, malice, rot. Where Ilias met his guardian, Rixidian met his own destruction. And from that day forward, the truth became undeniable. Some witches and wizards will never cast a Patronus, not because they lack talent, but because they lack something their magic cannot fake. 2. Animagus. Most animagi we see in the wizarding world look perfectly in control of their transformations, slipping between forms with ease. Animagi are, of course, witches and wizards capable of turning into a specific animal at will, without the need for a spell, incantation, or potion once the transformation is mastered. Their animal form is fixed. It reflects something essential about their nature, and it never changes over the course of their life. But the truth is, as easy as they make it look after the fact, becoming an animagus is one of the riskiest magical processes in existence. It's not a simple spell you can learn in school, or something you master through practice alone. There's no classroom for it, no official curriculum, no teacher willing to demonstrate it, and there's a very good reason for that. An animagus transformation requires perfect alignment between a witch or wizard's body, wand work, potion crafting, magical timing, and emotional self-control. Unlike conjurations or charms, this isn't about producing magic outside of you. It's about reshaping your actual identity. According to the official instructions documented on Pottermore, here's what needs to happen. You must master advanced transfiguration and potions, keep a mandrake leaf in your mouth for a full lunar month, then seal it with your hair and saliva in a crystal phial. You brew a complex potion with dew untouched by sunlight in a death's head hawkmoth chrysalis, recite Amato, Animo, Animato, Animagus at sunrise and sunset while waiting to feel a second heartbeat, and to leave the potion to mature until lightning strikes. After drinking it, you endure a painful transformation, confront your animal form without fear, and practice until the shift no longer requires a wand. And if just one step of this incredibly intricate process is mishandled, one measurement off, one moment of hesitation, or one emotional lapse, you don't just fail, you change, permanently. A failed animagus transformation can leave a witch or wizard trapped between forms permanently, half human, half beast, with no way back. And this isn't a hypothetical warning or some old superstition. The Ministry of Magic explicitly notes that botched transformations result in irreversible disfigurement, and that St. Mungos can do little, if anything, to help those who attempt the process incorrectly. You don't simply take a potion or try again later. You're done. Your form is sealed. 3. Apparition. Teleportation, also known as apparition in Harry Potter, is a magical means of transportation where the caster is able to instantly travel from one location to another. Many witches and wizards simply prefer conventional means of transport like brooms, flue powder, and portkeys. But for those special few that have honed this ability and enjoy doing it, apparition is certainly the way to go. From a utilitarian standpoint, it doesn't get much better than being able to instantly transport to your desired location with the snap of your fingers. However, it's a fairly advanced skill, which not all witches and wizards are able to perform. And for those that attempt it but don't quite get it right, there can be dire consequences. Splinching is the official term for what happens when part of a witch or wizard is left behind during the process. And we're not talking about losing your coat or dropping your wand. Splinching can involve chunks of flesh, hair, limbs, or other body parts being separated from you mid-travel. Notably, Ron Weasley gets splinched in the Deathly Hallows. Splinching, or the separation of random body parts, occurs when the mind is insufficiently determined. You must concentrate continually upon your destination, and move without haste, but with deliberation. The reason this happens is simple. Apparition relies on 3 exact principles: destination, determination, and deliberation. A witch or wizard needs to know exactly where they're going, have the magical willpower to get there, and maintain perfect focus while doing it. If even one of those elements falters, the magic doesn't transport you incorrectly. It transports part of you correctly and leaves the rest behind. A brief lapse, a flicker of doubt, or a misjudged destination isn't just embarrassing. It's a risk that might cost you a piece of yourself. Literally. Fiend Fire. Fiend Fire is one of the most dangerous forms of magic in the Wizarding worlds, not because it's difficult to cast, but because of what happens after the spell is created. Unlike normal conjured fire, Fiend Fire is a cursed blaze that grows on its own and forms living shapes. Serpents, birds, roaring lions, even chimera-like beasts, fueled by magic instead of fire. The real challenge isn't producing the fire, it's controlling it. Fiend Fire requires constant, precise magical command. If the caster fails to maintain control, even briefly, the flames stop responding to them and spread without restriction. And at that point, the caster has no reliable way of putting it out. We see this clearly in Deathly Hallows, when Vincent Crabbe conjures Fiend Fire inside the Room of Requirement. He succeeds in producing the curse, but because of his inexperience, can't manage it. The fire then rapidly expands, becoming too powerful to command, and ultimately kills him, while continuing to destroy everything in the room, including a Horcrux. Unlike most spells that simply fail when performed incorrectly, Fiend Fire carries a different risk. Even a correctly cast spell can become a threat if the caster lacks the skill to control it afterward. It isn't just a matter of magical talent, but of maintaining sustained mastery over a force that doesn't stop on its own. Legilimency. Legilimency is essentially the art of magically navigating through people's minds. It's often misunderstood as simple mind reading, but it goes far beyond that. It isn't a passive ability or a spell that shows you someone's thoughts on command. Legilimency involves navigating another person's mind, their memories, emotions, and hidden associations. It's a targeted intrusion that requires precision, awareness, and focus, and without those, the caster doesn't just fail, they risk exposing themselves. Unlike most spells, Legilimency is not one-directional. The moment at which a wizard attempts to look into someone else's mind, they also open a channel that can be turned back against them. This is why Snape emphasizes that a caster who lacks mental defenses, specifically occlumency, can accidentally reveal their own thoughts while trying to invade someone else's. We see this when Snape attempts to teach Harry occlumency in Order of the Phoenix. Harry, untrained and overwhelmed, suddenly slips into Snape's memories instead of blocking him, and the lesson demonstrates that a failed attempt at Legilimency does not simply produce no result. It can reverse the intended direction, giving the target access to the caster's private experiences. And while the risk isn't physical harm, it may be something far more serious to a witch or wizard. A failed attempt at Legilimency can reveal your own thoughts, memories, and vulnerabilities to the very person you were trying to spy on. In other words, Legilimency isn't just about breaking into someone else's mind. It requires protecting your own. Without the proper skill, the spell doesn't simply fail. It opens the wrong door. What if Muggles knew about magic? About witches, wizards, wands, spells, and flying broomsticks? And what would they say if they knew that some of these magical folk could teleport across the country in seconds, erase memories with a flick of the wrist, and kill without leaving a trace? Today we'll be answering a question that the foundation of the Wizarding world was built to avoid. What would happen if the Muggles found out about magic? Let's dive into it. The magical world's divide from the Muggle world is outlined pretty clearly in the first book, and it's certainly not a concept that's hard to understand. Wizards don't openly perform, talk about, or even acknowledge the existence of magic in front of Muggles. Entire streets, buildings, and institutions are hidden behind enchantments, and when something does go wrong, memory charms are used to help keep the illusion intact. The two worlds don't really coexist, they just kind of exist side by side, carefully separated by layers of magic, lore, and deliberate misinformation. And that separation isn't just cultural or unspoken, it's enforced by a single law at the heart of the Wizarding world, the International Statute of Secrecy. And the purpose of the statute is simple: to ensure that magic remains hidden from non-magical people at all costs. It governs how witches and wizards interact with Muggles, restricts the public use of magic, and requires magical authorities to intervene whenever secrecy is threatened. In other words, the law was devised to protect the existence of the wizarding world itself. It was built for self-preservation. But in today's video, I want to discuss a world where that law no longer exists. A world where the statute of secrecy fails, or is deliberately broken, and magic is suddenly exposed to modern Muggle society. I'd like to explore how Muggles would actually react to discovering magic today, how governments and institutions would respond, and perhaps most importantly, what the consequences would be for the divide between the two worlds. But in order to get there, first we need to take a step back. Because as strange as it sounds, the wizarding world wasn't always hidden, and Muggles, a very long time ago, knew quite a lot about magic. And before we start thinking about what they would do, first we need to take a look at what they've already done. The truth is that for centuries, the line separating Muggle from magical simply didn't exist in the way it does today. Witches and wizards even lived among non-magical people, often using their abilities to help friends and neighbours, healing illness, preventing the spread of disease, or easing injuries when no other options were available. And for the most part, there was no inherent hostility between the two communities. But that uneasy balance didn't last. Because beginning as early as the 14th century, Muggle attitudes toward magic began to change. Fear replaced familiarity, and suspicion replaced trust. Across Europe, and eventually beyond, those with magical abilities were accused of consorting with dark forces, put on trial, and condemned to death. And over the course of roughly 400 years, tens of thousands of people were tried for witchcraft, with many executed for crimes that, in reality, amounted to simply being different. Dumbledore's notes in his copy of The Wizard and the Hopping Pot describe just how dangerous everyday life had become for wizardkind during this period. The persecution of witches and wizards was gathering pace all over Europe in the early 15th century. Many in the magical community felt, and with good reason, that offering to cast a spell on the Muggle next door's sickly pig was tantamount to volunteering to fetch the firewood for one's own funeral pyre. "Let the Muggles manage without us," was the cry, as the wizards drew further and further apart from their non-magical brethren. As fear spread, witches and wizards were forced to adapt. Many began living double lives, using concealment charms to protect themselves and their families. And eventually, entire magical households started establishing hidden communities within Muggle villages, present but unseen. As the witch hunts grew fiercer, that secrecy began to turn inward as well. By the 17th century, even fraternizing with Muggles could make a witch or wizard suspect within their own community, an outcast among their peers. It was clear that something had to change. By the late 17th century, tensions between the two worlds had reached a breaking point, with well-respected members of the wizarding community attempting to appeal directly to Muggle authority, pleading for protection under non-magical law. But those appeals just went unanswered, and with no assurance of safety and no sign that persecution would end, wizardkind made a decision that would reshape history. They withdrew. What followed was the introduction of the International Statute of Secrecy, first signed in 1689 and officially ratified in 1692. Enacted by the International Confederation of Wizards, the statute was designed to permanently conceal the existence of witches and wizards from the Muggle population, placing responsibility on each magical government to control magical activity and prevent exposure at all costs. On the surface, the statute appears to mark the beginning of peace, an end to witch hunts, persecution, and open conflict. But it also created something else entirely, a permanent, enforced divide between the magical and non-magical worlds. And that divide would go on to define everything that followed. Which brings us to today. In the modern era, only a handful of Muggles know anything at all about the wizarding world. This includes the parents of Muggle-born witches and wizards and, at the very highest level of government, the British Prime Minister, who was traditionally informed of the existence of the wizarding world on the night of their appointment. And I've got to say, I'm really not sure how we got to this point. The Statute of Secrecy was enacted in 1692, 333 years ago. And while that might sound like a long time, the 3 centuries also seems like hardly long enough to completely erase centuries of shared history, but nevertheless, that seems to be the reality. I guess it's a testament to just how powerful the combined efforts of wizardkind have been in enforcing the Statute of Secrecy. Now, let's imagine this. Tomorrow, at the end of December 2025, the International Statute of Secrecy breaks. For one reason or another, witches and wizards across the world simply stop upholding the law entirely. There's no coordinated announcement, no formal declaration. Magic just starts appearing willy-nilly. Spells are cast in public. Magical creatures are seen where they shouldn't be. Witches and wizards are flying about. Enchantments fail, concealments drop, and things that were meant to stay hidden are suddenly visible to, well, anyone. I think that at first people would assume that it's all fake. CGI, a hoax, some unexplainable advancement in AI. But as the so-called stunt dragged on for days, then weeks, and the evidence kept piling up, I suspect that denial would slowly become impossible. Magic exists, and Muggles are there to witness it. At first, the realization wouldn't arrive all at once. It would settle in slowly, uncomfortably. News outlets would stop using words like alleged and unconfirmed. Governments would stop dismissing the footage as fake. And emergency meetings would be held behind closed doors, long before any official statements were made. And I also believe that, almost immediately, the existence of this magical world would be treated as a threat. Because from a Muggle perspective, this isn't just the discovery of something extraordinary. It's the sudden realization that there are people living among them who can do things that ignore every rule the modern world is built on. It's realizing all at once that there are people out there who can reshape reality in ways that can't be explained or controlled. And once denial collapses, the question isn't really about magic anymore, it's about people. I think conversations would shift from is this real to who controls this and how do we protect ourselves. Because when humans are confronted with something that upends their understanding of the world, the reaction is almost never calm acceptance. It's curiosity mixed with fear, fascination mixed with suspicion, and above all, a need to make sense of the unknown by putting it into familiar categories. I think that, some people would be amazed. They'd want to see more, learn more, and potentially even try to experience it for themselves. But others would be deeply unsettled, not because magic exists, but because it introduces a kind of uncertainty they never prepared for. And history shows us that when humans encounter something they don't understand, the instinct is to control it, contain it, or explain it away. Magic wouldn't be treated as a miracle for very long. It would be treated as a problem that needs to be solved. Now, the fact remains that the Muggle Prime Minister, the leading member of government in the Muggle world, does already know about the magical world. So in theory, at least he wouldn't be completely blindsided. He'd probably even try to get ahead of the situation by calming the public and keeping things from spiraling out of control. But the problem is simple. He's just one man. And I don't think that any single person, no matter how informed, could control a global reaction to something this disruptive. Once magic is out in the open, it stops being a political issue and becomes a social one. And there's another problem. If the Prime Minister appeared to know too much about the magical world, that knowledge wouldn't reassure the public, it would do the opposite. Because from a Muggle perspective, the first question would be, why didn't you tell us sooner? And the next one would be, what else have you been hiding? It wouldn't exactly spur confidence. People would feel misled, manipulated, and deliberately kept in the dark about something that directly affects their safety and understanding of reality itself. And with that trust broken, I believe that any attempts to calm the public would only make things worse. This leaves us with two things happening at once: the sudden appearance of a powerful, unexplainable phenomenon, and a complete collapse of trust in government. And when that happens, society doesn't move in one direction. It splinters. Some people would be amazed. To them, magic would feel hopeful, proof that the world is bigger, stranger, and full of new possibilities. They'd want to learn more, understand it, maybe even celebrate it. And it wouldn't take long for a more uncomfortable question to surface. Why them? Magic, as far as we know, isn't something you can learn. You're either born with it or you're not. And the moment that reality sets in, admiration starts to give way to resentment. But others wouldn't see wonder at all. They'd see risk. The idea that someone could alter memories, teleport across the country, or brew love potions without consequence wouldn't feel exciting, it would feel dangerous, a breakdown of safety. And then there are those who are caught in the middle, curious but cautious, open-minded but uneasy, unsure what to believe or who to trust. And these divides would deepen quickly. Because magic isn't something you can disagree about quietly. It touches fear, belief, identity, and power. And once the question stops being, is this real, and becomes, what does this mean for me, the damage is already done. As the saying goes, people fear what they don't understand and hate what they can't conquer. And magic would be both. In the days and weeks that followed, reactions wouldn't just differ, they'd harden. Groups would begin to form around what magic should mean, and what should be done about the people who wield it. Some would demand answers, others would demand action, and many would demand accountability for the fact that this had been hidden for so long. Many would expect them to step forward and start fixing things. Disease, climate, poverty, war, and when magic inevitably failed to solve problems that were never simple to begin with, admiration would quickly turn to resentment. At the same time, fascination would curdle into obsession. Some people would treat witches and wizards like celebrities or demigods or resources. The wealthy would try to buy access. Others would try to monetize magic outright. And there would be no shortage of opportunists, magical and non-magical alike, willing to sell their loyalty, their abilities, or their silence in exchange for money, protection, or prestige. Then there are the darker instincts. Fear doesn't just create caution, it creates hostility. Religious extremism would resurface, framing magic as unnatural or dangerous. Conspiracy theories would thrive, and there would be people who don't just want to understand magic, but to study it, test it, control it, regardless of consent. History has shown us what happens when fear meets power imbalance. Anti-magic movements would emerge. So would radical magical purists, viewing Muggles as a threat that finally confirmed their worst suspicions. Clashes wouldn't start as wars. They'd start as isolated incidents, attacks, retaliation, justifications framed as self-defense. And slowly, the idea of coexistence would begin to erode. And this is where things start to feel eerily familiar. Because none of this would actually be new. As I mentioned earlier, long before the Statute of Secrecy, witches and wizards already lived openly among Muggles. They helped where they could, they healed the sick, they used magic to improve everyday life. And for a time, that uneasy coexistence worked, right up until fear began to outweigh gratitude. When magic stopped being understood, it stopped being welcomed. When it couldn't be controlled, it became something to fear. And when fear took hold, coexistence collapsed. And I think that what we'd witness in the modern world would be history coming full circle. The same questions would surface, just framed in modern language. Why should they have this power? Why don't we? Why should they be trusted? And just like before, those questions wouldn't stay theoretical for long. The instinct to dominate what can't be understood remains the same. Different century, different tools, same outcome. In that sense, the Statute of Secrecy doesn't just look like a law meant to hide magic. It starts to look like a lesson learned the hard way. A recognition that the first attempt at coexistence failed, and that without secrecy, the second attempt might fail in exactly the same way. Only this time, the consequences wouldn't be limited to a few villages or kingdoms. They'd be global. And I think that ultimately, it would lead to one of the worst and most destructive wars either world had ever seen. And that's it for this video. If you enjoyed the content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, remember, it does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live.